a girl could have been killed for a scrap of paper smaller than her thumb. It was not the whole plan for D-Day, not a map of every beach, not the secret that would decide the war alone. But inside occupied France, one folded message in a brown coat could expose names, safe houses, railway routes, and people waiting in the dark. Before the ships reached Normandy, danger was already moving through markets, checkpoints, muddy roads, and quiet rooms where no one could afford one mistake. Tonight, we follow the girl who carried that paper through a village where looking too calm could be just as deadly as being caught. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if this quiet kind of war history is something you truly enjoy. And tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is there. It always makes these stories feel less distant, knowing they are being heard in different places around the world. Now, lower the lights. Let the room grow calm, and let's step into this hidden road war D-Day together tonight. At the end of a crowded French railway platform, a German soldier checked papers one by one while a young girl waited with a ticket in her hand. She wore a brown coat, a dark blue scarf, and the tired expression of someone delayed too many times in an occupied country. Inside the lining of her sleeve, under a rough stitch that looked like a poor repair, a folded paper rested against her arm. It was smaller than a matchbox. The paper did not contain the whole plan for D-Day. No courier in a public station would be trusted with an invasion plan involving beaches, ships, aircraft, weather, deception, and thousands of men. Secret work survived by breaking information into small pieces, so one arrest could not destroy everything. That made the paper dangerous in a different way. It might have carried a name, a password, a meeting place, a railway line, or a bridge marked for sabotage. To a stranger, it could look like useless signs and short words. To the right contact, it could tell a resistance cell where to move before the landings. To the wrong hands, it could open a path to arrests. The girl had been chosen because she looked harmless. In occupied France, a young woman with a basket, a tired face, and a simple reason to travel could sometimes pass where a man of fighting age would be stopped and searched. She could say she was visiting family, buying food, going to church, or returning from work. The cruel trick of secret war was that survival often depended on looking too ordinary to remember. The soldier did not need to find the paper at once. He only had to notice fingers held too close to one sleeve, an answer too clean, or a pass that looked newer than the rest of her things. A local collaborator nearby could be worse than a German stranger, because he might recognize her village or family name. Paperwork could lie, but memory often did not. She had practiced her reason for travel until it sounded dull, not brave, not frightened, not clever. A poor girl in wartime needed to sound annoyed by delay, not terrified by risk. If she acted too calmly, she might look trained. The station protected her and trapped her at the same time. The crowd made her one face among many, yet it also meant she could not escape if a soldier ordered her aside. Running would confess guilt before anyone touched her coat. Standing still was its own kind of courage. Before D-Day, resistance networks, allied planners, and secret organizations needed people like her. Radios were useful but dangerous, and not every message could safely be spoken into the air. Couriers carried details about roads, railways, bridges, German movements, safe houses, false papers, and sabotage plans. Small facts mattered because large armies moved through small places. The girl probably did not know how her message fit into the larger operation. She might know only the next contact, the sign to look for, and what to do if the meeting failed. That ignorance protected the network. It also left her carrying danger she could not fully measure. If she were captured, the punishment would not stop with her. A name on the paper could lead that house to a cellar, and that cellar to a radio or another courier. People who never saw the station could be in danger because of the seam in her sleeve. One scrap could become a map. This is why the paper could be more frightening than a rifle. A rifle threatened the person in front of it, but a captured message could travel backward through a hidden network, could expose those who cut rails, guided airmen, stored explosives, moved maps, or allowed a stranger to sleep in a barn. Today, it would be like carrying a phone full of contacts and locations, except the password was only a weak line of thread. The line moved forward. The soldier looked at her papers, then at her face, then back at the papers. His expression was not dramatic, and that made the moment worse. Ordinary suspicion was enough. He asked where she was going. She gave the answer she had practiced, with just enough irritation to sound like a hungry girl delayed by authority. He asked why she was travelling that day. She answered without touching the sleeve. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Behind her, someone coughed. A train hissed nearby, and the sound made her want to turn her head. But she kept her eyes where they belonged. Then the soldier handed the papers back. She took them without showing relief. Relief could betray her as quickly as fear. She stepped past the barrier, kept her pace even, and moved toward the platform edge, as if nothing important had happened. The paper was still hidden. Passing the first check did not make her safe. It only meant that one pair of eyes had failed to see the thing that could destroy her. Ahead were streets, church doors, markets, roadblocks, and people who might remember what she wished they would forget. She had not escaped the danger. The coat still felt heavy, though the paper weighed almost nothing. If a soldier pressed the sleeve and felt stiffness under the lining, the repair would stop looking poor and start looking deliberate. A knife could open it easily. What followed would be simple and brutal. The paper would be placed on a table. Names would be circled, addresses checked, and questions repeated until someone broke. A safe house could be emptied too late. A railway team could arrive at a bridge and find soldiers waiting. She moved through the station like a girl with nothing to hide. That was the only way to survive. The secret had to remain smaller than her breathing, smaller than her face, smaller than the ticket in her hand. What is most disturbing is not that she carried a dangerous message, but that she had to make it look like an errand. The paper in her coat survived the railway station, but its real weight came from the hidden rooms where D-Day was being prepared in pieces. The story now moves from the crowd platform to a closed room filled with maps, passwords, radio silence, and people measuring roads they might never walk. One wrong mark on a railway map could send saboteurs to the wrong bridge and leave German reinforcements moving toward the beaches before daylight came. The room had its curtains closed before the street lamps came on. A railway map lay across the wooden table, held flat by a cup and a pocket knife. Someone had marked villages in pencil, then rubbed one mark until a grey smear stayed. The radio sat covered nearby. A woman near the window kept 2 fingers on the curtain edge. An older man, bent over the map with his spectacles low on his nose, reading the same rail junction twice. A young courier stood by the stove, holding her gloves, waiting to be told which road mattered. Nobody looked heroic. D-Day was not only being prepared by men in uniform across the channel. It was also being prepared in rooms like this, where people whispered over roads, bridges, and rail lines, while German boots passed below. Once troops reached the beaches, German reinforcements would start moving through France. A delayed train could matter. The map did not feel like paper to the people around it. The thin black railway line could become a column of soldiers. A small bridge near a village could become the place where a sabotage team waited in wet grass. A road bend could decide whether trucks arrived before dawn or after it. The networks needed local eyes. They needed someone who knew which road flooded after rain, which bridge was guarded at night, and which station had extra soldiers. London could plan a landing, but a farmer, a station worker, or a girl carrying bread could know the ground. Secret war depended on ordinary people noticing ordinary things before soldiers turned them into orders. The radio under the cloth made everyone careful. It could bring a coded phrase, confirm a drop, or warn that a route was no longer safe, but it could also invite hunters if used too long. When it was uncovered, even a chair sounded too loud. One man stopped breathing when a cartwheel cracked outside. On the table, a pencil rolled toward the edge. The young courier caught it before it fell, and the small movement made 3 people look at her hand. They were not angry. They were afraid of every sound. The message could not be written like a letter. It had to be short enough to hide, clear enough for the right person to use, and useless enough if a German soldier found it. A name might become a symbol, a bridge a local mark, and an hour a number that meant nothing alone. Too much could kill, too little could fail. The man with the spectacles wrote one word, crossed it out, and wrote a smaller one beneath it. The woman at the curtain watched his hand, as if the pencil itself might betray them. A cold cup of coffee sat beside the map. Near it lay a scrap from a larger sheet. The stakes were larger than the room, but no one said that out loud. A broken rail might hold up a German unit for a few hours, and a few hours could change what happened near the beaches. A cut telephone line could slow orders, while a confused route could cost a commander time he could not recover. In a normal office, a wrong note makes confusion, but here a wrong note could put a living man beside the wrong bridge at the wrong hour. A needle and dark thread waited near the paper. The message would not be left in a pocket where a quick search could find it. It would travel in cloth, under a seam, close to the skin. The coat on the chair looked like a risk waiting to be worn. The people in the room knew what discovery meant. German security could raid the house, seize the radio, tear open mattresses, empty drawers, and drag everyone inside into separate rooms. A frightened person might reveal a contact without meaning to. One arrest spread. No one explained it. It showed in the way they avoided full names, in the way the young courier rubbed her thumb against one glove seam, and in the way the older man paused before marking the map again. Outside, a dog barked, a bicycle bell rang, and someone laughed too loudly down the street. Inside, nobody smiled. The girl watched the map, then the paper, then the folded coat. She might not know which beach would be attacked. She might not even know the date. What unsettles me is how much of a vast invasion could pass through a room where people tried not to make noise. Her task was simple and personal. Carry the message, find the right contact, and do not let fear make her memorable. The older man folded the scrap once, then again, testing its size against the inside of a sleeve. The woman at the curtain nodded after the street below went quiet. The message was ready. In that closed room, D-Day existed as pencil marks, cold coffee, a covered radio, and people afraid to say too much aloud. The next danger would be smaller than the room itself, because the whole instruction had to fit onto a scrap that could pass through searchers and suspicious eyes. One unclear symbol or mistaken hour could send the wrong person to a German patrol before the beaches ever saw daylight. The hand above the paper moved slowly because there was almost no space for error. A small oil lamp burned low on the table, making the pencil shadow shake across the wood. The paper itself had been cut from a larger sheet, trimmed again, then flattened under a cup so it would not curl at the edges. It looked too small to hold fear. The man writing did not press hard. A deep mark could remain on the sheet beneath it, and even that could become evidence if the room was searched later. He wrote a few symbols, paused, and wiped the pencil tip against the side of his thumb. The grey dust stayed on his skin. A name could not be written as a name. A place could not be written too clearly. A time had to be exact, but not so obvious that a soldier could understand it after one glance. Every word had to be useful and dangerous at the same time. The young courier stood near the table, watching him reduce a living route into signs. She saw one mark for a road, another for a meeting place, and a short code that meant more to the receiver than it said on the paper. The message was not meant to be read like a letter. It was meant to be unlocked. This was why secret messages were often small, coded, and incomplete. A full explanation might help the right person, but it would help the Germans even more if the courier were caught. Too little information could make the receiver hesitate or move to the wrong place. Too much could expose everyone. That balance sat on the pencil point. A single scrap had to be clear enough to save a mission and vague enough to survive enemy hands. The woman by the lamp leaned closer and whispered one correction, then stopped herself before saying the full name of the village. She tapped the map instead. The man understood and changed one mark, making it shorter and harder to read. The courier noticed that no one smiled after the correction. Even the hour mattered. If the paper said the wrong time, a sabotage team might arrive after the patrol changed, or before the guard left, or at the exact moment German trucks were passing. A meeting place could be empty for 5 minutes and deadly 10 minutes later. War made time narrow. The pencil moved again. The man wrote a number, paused, scratched it out, and wrote another beside it. The scratch looked ugly on the small paper, so he cut a fresh piece and began again. Nobody complained. The room had objects that looked harmless until you understood their purpose. There was a thread for closing the coat lining, a blunt needle, a heel of bread no one had eaten, and a small tin that could hide folded paper under its false bottom. A glove lay open beside the map. The inside seam had already been loosened. The courier rubbed one finger along her own sleeve without thinking. The older woman noticed and gently pulled her hand away from the cloth. It was not a scolding. It was practice for the road. A person carrying a hidden message had to forget where it was, or at least behave as if she had forgotten. If her hand returned to the hiding place too often, a guard might follow the gesture. If she walked too stiffly, someone might wonder what she was protecting. The body could betray the paper before the paper was found. The man folded the finished scrap once. Then he folded it again with the edge of his fingernail, pressing the crease flat. He folded it a third time until it became smaller than a thumbnail and thick enough to feel if someone knew where to touch. Small did not mean safe. The marks inside were not many. A code name, a time, a route, a sign for the person who would receive it. The courier looked at the folded paper and understood that she would not be able to fix anything once she left the room. That was the worst part of carrying written orders. A spoken message could be repeated differently if someone looked confused, but a hidden scrap could only say what it already said. If one symbol was wrong, the mistake travelled with it. If one mark was too clear, danger travelled with it, too. The older woman took the scrap and held it near the lamp for one last look. Her eyes narrowed, not because she doubted the mission, but because age and poor light made small writing cruel. She read it once, then once more, then nodded. Her hand was steady only after she set it down. Today, we expect a message to be corrected, deleted, resent, or checked again, but this one had to leave the room as a final version stitched into cloth. There would be no second copy carried openly in a pocket. There would be no note explaining the code. There would be no kind margin where someone could add a warning. The needle went through the coat lining with a soft pull. Dark thread closed over the hidden paper, looking clumsy enough to be ignored. The young courier watched each stitch bury the message deeper. She could still see where it was. When the work was finished, the coat looked poor and ordinary again. That was the point. A clean hiding place might invite to suspicion, but an ugly repair on an old coat belonged to hunger, wear, and bad weather. Poverty could become camouflage. The courier put the coat on. For a moment nobody spoke. The sleeve touched her arm in a different way now, and she had to train herself not to feel it too much. The paper was no longer on the table. It was part of her. She was told the simple things again: where to go, what not to say, when to abandon the meeting, and which sign meant danger. She repeated only what she needed. The man with the pencil listened without looking at her too kindly, because kindness could make fear worse. He gave her the ticket last. What stays with me is how the smallest object in that room forced everyone to become careful with their hands, their words, and even their breathing. A paper that size should have meant nothing. Instead, it decided where a girl would walk, how she would stand, and who might live if she arrived. The message had been cut, coded, folded, and sewn away until it looked like nothing more than a bad repair inside an old coat. But once the coat was buttoned, the danger no longer belonged to the table, the pencil, or the people in the room. In the next part, one careless search of that ordinary sleeve could turn a poor brown coat into the only evidence a German officer needed. An old brown coat lay across the table, with its sleeve spread out like something already worn down by too many winters. Its cloth had gone thin at the elbows, and one cuff carried a dark stain that washing had never fully removed. Near the inside lining, a small tear had been opened wider, just enough for the folded paper to slide into the seam. Then the needle returned to work. The woman sewing it did not try to make the repair neat. A neat stitch could look planned, and a planned stitch could invite fingers. She used dark thread, pulled unevenly, and left the seam looking like the work of someone poor, hurried, and used to fixing the same garment too many times. That ugliness was useful. The coat had to look ordinary from every distance. From across the street, it needed to belong to a girl walking through shortages, cold mornings, and dull errands. From 2 steps away, it needed to look too tired to examine closely. Under a guard's hand, it needed to feel like worn cloth and bad repair, not a hiding place. A new coat would have been a mistake. Clean buttons, fresh wool, and smooth lining could draw attention in a country where people patched, traded, and wore the same clothes until they nearly failed. Poverty gave the coat a story before the girl even opened her mouth. The story had to be boring. That was the safety of it. Couriers used whatever the body could carry without seeming to carry anything. Messages could be hidden in shoes, under hat bands, inside hems, in food wrappers, between pages of a book, under a compact mirror, or folded into a glove. Some information travelled only in memory. Some travelled in objects that looked too personal to search quickly. The coat was personal enough to help, but not personal enough to protect her if suspicion grew. A rough guard could still order her to remove it. A woman working for the authorities could search the lining more carefully than a man at a roadside post. A knife could open every repair in less than a minute. Cloth was not magic. The girl watched the needle pass through the lining. Each pull of thread seemed to make the paper less visible and more dangerous. When it had been lying on the table, at least everyone could see what they feared. Once it disappeared into the sleeve, the fear moved into her body. She tried the coat on before leaving. The sleeve brushed her wrist, and she immediately knew where the paper was. That was a problem. If she could, she might guard it without meaning to, and if she guarded it, someone else might notice. The worst hiding place was not the one a soldier could find, but the one the courier could not stop remembering. The older woman adjusted the shoulder and tugged the sleeve down as if checking the fit. Really, she was watching the girl's face. The girl forced herself not to look at the seam. Her hands stayed at her sides. On the chair beside the table sat a dark red scarf and a pair of worn black shoes. The scarf was not chosen for beauty. It gave the eye somewhere else to rest, away from the sleeve. The shoes were scuffed enough to support the same story as the coat. A young woman with little money and nothing worth stealing. Small details carried the disguise. A loose button made the coat look old. A frayed hem made it look neglected. The lining smelled faintly of dust, smoke, and damp wool. None of this was heroic, but all of it helped create a person the guards might not want to remember. A coat like that could pass through a market without becoming a subject. It could stand in a church line, brush against strangers on a train platform, or hang from the girl's arm while she counted coins in front of a bakery. The less special it appeared, the more useful it became. Ordinary cloth did quite well, but the paper changed everything. If searched and found, the coat would stop being a poor girl's garment and become proof. The bad stitching would become intentional. The sleeve would become a container. The girl would become someone who had carried a hidden message before a military operation that the Germans were desperate to disrupt. There would be no harmless explanation for that. She could not say she had forgotten it was there. She could not claim it had been sewn by accident. A folded paper with a code, a route, or a meeting time did not belong inside clothing unless someone feared open eyes. A coat can keep a person warm, but in that moment it could also sign her death warrant. The people in the room understood this without saying it too plainly. The man checked the door latch twice. The woman gathered loose threads from the nubble, pushed them into the stove so no matching scraps remained. The girl picked up the scarf, then put it down again, then picked it up more slowly. Her hands needed training, too. She was told not to keep touching the sleeve. She was told not to hold her arm stiffly. She was told not to sit with the hidden side turned away from everyone because that would make the protection too obvious. The instruction sounded simple until she tried to do it. Her own body felt watched. The coat asked her to lie without speaking. It asked her to walk with normal weight on both feet, to lift her arm naturally, to take papers from a pocket without flinching, and to let strangers come close enough to smell the damp wool. It asked her not to become the secret she carried. That was difficult. Before she left, the older woman brushed dust from the front of the coat. It was an ordinary gesture, almost motherly, but her fingers paused for half a second near the hidden seam. The pause was small enough that no stranger would notice. The girl noticed. What stays with me is how a garment made for cold weather became a test of every nerve in her body. The coat did not protect her from fear. It only gave fear a place to sit close against her skin. Once she buttoned it, the room no longer held the evidence. She stepped toward the door, looking poorer, duller, and more harmless than she had looked an hour earlier. That was the disguise. The paper was hidden, the repair looked ugly, and the coat gave away nothing to anyone who did not already know where to look. Now the rest depended on her face. The old brown coat had become a hiding place, a disguise, and a piece of evidence waiting to be discovered. But cloth alone could not save her, because the other half of the cover had to come from the way she looked, walked, and answered ordinary questions in the street. In the next part, one expression too calm or one nervous glance toward a bakery window could make a German guard wonder why a hungry girl looked like she was carrying more than bread money. A small, empty basket made the disguise easier to believe. A few coins sat at the bottom, dull from too many hands, and a folded cloth covered nothing at all. The girl tied a plain scarf over her hair, checked the brown coat once in the mirror, and forced her shoulders to sit lower. She had to look tired, not hunted. In a village under occupation, tiredness was normal. People walked with less food in them, less sleep behind their eyes, and less patience for questions. A girl going out to look for bread did not need to look cheerful. She only needed to look believable. The basket gave her a reason to move through the street. The coins gave her a reason to stop at a shop, ask about flour, complain about prices, and leave with nothing if there was nothing to buy. The scarf made her face less noticeable from a distance. The whole cover was built from small, poor things. That was what made it useful. She stepped into the street in a blue-grey dress under the old coat, with the basket hanging from one arm. The village looked ordinary in the way occupied places learn to look ordinary, with shutters half closed, women waiting near shop doors, and men speaking only when they had to. A bakery stood ahead with its door partly shut. At the corner, 2 German soldiers watched the street. She could not avoid looking at them too carefully, because avoiding them too carefully was also a kind of attention. She let her eyes pass over them as if they were part of the street, no different from the cartwheel by the wall or the cracked stone under her shoe. Her face had to hold mild annoyance, hunger, and routine. The hardest part was not pretending to be someone else, but pretending to be a simpler version of herself. A courier needed a reason for each movement. If she turned left, there had to be a shop, a church, a relative, a well, or some errand that matched the hour. If she stopped, there had to be something worth stopping for. If she crossed the street, it could not look like fear made the decision. She walked slowly enough for hunger, but not so slowly that she seemed to be watching the soldiers. Her hands stayed away from the hidden seam. The basket swung lightly, empty enough to make a soft scrape against her skirt. She listened without turning her head. The bakery window held only a few hard loaves and some dark crumbs near the back of the shelf. A woman in line looked at the girl, then at the basket, then looked away. That glance helped the disguise. People recognized hunger faster than they recognized courage. Inside the shop, she asked a simple question and received a simple refusal. There was little bread left. Maybe later, maybe not. She let disappointment show because disappointment belonged to the role. Relief did not. Outside, the soldiers were still at the corner. One smoked with his helmet pushed slightly back. The other looked bored, which could be safer or worse depending on the minute. Bored men sometimes missed things. Bored men sometimes invented reasons to interfere. The girl counted her coins again in the open, giving herself a reason to stand still. Her thumb moved across the worn edges while her sleeve rested close to her side. The paper in the lining was close enough to remember and dangerous enough to ignore. She kept her breathing dull. A good cover could fail if it were too perfect. A girl who answered every question too smoothly might sound rehearsed. A girl who never glanced at a soldier might look trained. A girl who looked too calm in a street full of uniforms might become more suspicious than one who showed ordinary irritation. In war, even calm could become evidence if it sat on the wrong face. She moved past the bakery and toward the small market square. A woman carried turnips in a cloth bag. A child dragged a wooden crate with one broken corner. An old man stood near a wall with his cap in both hands, waiting for something no one had promised him. These people helped hide her because they were all trying to pass through the same hard day. But they could also ruin her. If someone asked where she was going and her answer did not match the basket, the time, the street, or the story known by others, suspicion could grow fast. A local informer did not need proof. He needed only a reason to whisper. The girl had practiced several small lies. She could say she'd been sent by her mother, or that she was looking for bread for a sick aunt, or that she had heard flour might arrive near the church. None of these lies sounded important. That was their strength. Her feet wanted to hurry once she left the soldiers behind. She did not allow it. A girl looking for bread did not suddenly speed up after passing a corner unless something was wrong. She kept the basket visible and her face tired. Each step had to belong to the errand. The street narrowed near a closed shop, and she saw her reflection in the dark glass. For 1 second she looked too alert. Her eyes were sharper than they should have been, and her mouth was held too tight. She lowered her gaze, adjusted the basket cloth, and let her face fall back into hunger. What stays with me is how survival could depend on making fear look like fatigue. At the edge of the square, a German soldier called for papers from a man with a bicycle. People slowed without meaning to, then pretended not to slow. The girl looked toward the bakery again, as if deciding whether to return later. The basket made the movement natural. Her cover was now ready for its first real test. The street, the scarf, the coins, the empty basket, and the tired face all had to become one harmless story if anyone stopped her. The paper inside the coat had no value if the girl carrying it could not become invisible in plain sight. She had turned herself into a hungry village girl with an empty basket. But the disguise only worked as long as no one forced her to explain it too closely. The next danger would come at a checkpoint, where every person had to pull papers from a pocket and answer questions under watchful eyes. One wrong pause, one mismatched detail, or one local collaborator recognizing her face could move her from the road into a room she might never leave. Rain had turned the village road dark before the checkpoint came fully into view. A wooden barrier blocked the way, with 2 German soldiers standing beside it under wet helmets, their shoulders shiny from the drizzle. A local collaborator sat near an ammunition crate with a notebook open on his knee, writing names slowly, as if each line had weight. Civilians waited in a crooked line, holding papers under coats, baskets, hats, and folded newspapers to keep them dry. The girl joined the line with her empty basket on one arm. The rain helped her look miserable, impatient, and cold, which made her tired face easier to believe. It also made the brown coat damp enough to cling closer to her sleeve. She could feel the hidden paper more clearly now. That was not good. The checkpoint was not large, but it had the power to stop a whole day. A cart waited with one wheel in a puddle. A woman held a child under her shawl, and an old man kept wiping his identity card with his thumb. Nobody wanted trouble. Nobody wanted to be noticed. German control in occupied villages often worked through small routines like this. Papers were checked, names were compared, reasons for travel were questioned, and people learned to shape their errands around curfews and roadblocks. A checkpoint did not need to look dramatic to be dangerous. It only needed time. The girl watched without staring. One soldier took papers and passed them to the man with the notebook. The collaborator looked at the face longer than the soldiers did, because faces were part of his work. He knew which families belonged nearby, which people had moved recently, and which names did not fit. A stranger with a rifle could frighten her, but a neighbour with a notebook could ruin her faster. The line moved forward slowly. A man with a bicycle explained why he was going to a farm, and the soldier made him repeat the answer. A woman said she needed flour, and the collaborator asked which baker had told her to come this way. The woman answered too quickly, then corrected herself. Everyone heard the correction. The girl lowered her eyes to the basket. A few coins showed under the cloth, placed there on purpose, dull and believable. Her hands wanted to tighten around the handle, but she kept them loose. She could not let the basket become a shield. When her turn came, the soldier held out his hand. She gave him her identity card and travel paper, both slightly damp at the edges. He looked at the documents, then at her face, then at the basket. The collaborator stopped writing. The first question was easy. Where was she going? She gave the village name she had practiced with a small tired lift in her voice, as if the answer was boring even to her. The second question came faster. Why? She said she had been told there might be bread near the church road. She did not say too much. Too much detail could sound prepared. Hunger did not need a speech. The soldier glanced at the basket again. It was empty, which matched the story, but an empty basket could also mean she had not truly gone anywhere yet. He asked where she had come from. She answered slowly enough to sound annoyed by the rain, not scared of the question. The paper inside her sleeve did nothing. It made no sound, gave no weight, and showed no edge through the cloth. Still, her whole arm seemed to know it was there. She let the sleeve hang naturally. She did not brush water from it. The collaborator leaned forward and asked if her mother was still living on the same street. The question was soft, almost casual, and that made it worse. It told her he knew something, or wanted her to think he did. Her throat tightened before her face changed. She answered as if the question irritated her. Yes, still there, sick this week. That explained the errand. It also explained why a young girl might be outside alone in the rain. The collaborator looked at her a moment longer. The soldier did not understand the village's meaning behind the question, but he understood the delay. Delay could become suspicion if fed enough. 1 minute could break a schedule. At another road, someone might already be waiting for her. A contact might stand near a wall, count the passing bells, then leave if she did not appear. A safe route might remain safe for half an hour and become unsafe after that. Being held did not need to last long to damage the whole message. The soldier asked her to open the basket. She lifted the cloth, showing coins, nothing else, and the scratched bottom where old straw had rubbed the wood pail. He poked it once with 2 fingers. The basket gave him no reason to continue. Then he touched her coat. Not a search. Not yet. Only a wet pinch at the front of the cloth, as if testing whether she hid something bulky. Her heart struck hard enough that she had to look irritated before fear reached her face. The sleeve with the paper stayed away from his hand. There are moments when survival is only the distance between a soldier's fingers and the wrong seam. He let go. The collaborator wrote something in the notebook, or pretended to. The soldier handed back her papers with a bored flick, already looking at the next person in line. She took them, placed them back inside her pocket, and did not move too quickly. Fast relief was almost as dangerous as panic. She stepped past the barrier into the road beyond. Rain tapped the basketball rim. Mud pressed against her shoes. Behind her, the checkpoint continued swallowing people one by one, asking ordinary questions that could turn into traps. Only after several steps did she allow herself to breathe deeper. Even then, she did it carefully, like a girl angry about the weather and bad bread, not a courier who had just passed through a narrow opening in the occupation. The paper was still hidden, the meeting was still possible, but the checkpoint had changed something inside her. It had shown her that documents could be correct and still not be enough. A face, a family name, a street, a mother's illness, a small hesitation, these could matter more than stamps. What stays with me is how the danger did not come as shouting, but as a simple question asked by someone who knew the village too well. She had crossed the first checkpoint with her papers, her basket, and the hidden message still intact. But correct documents could only protect her from strangers, not from people who remembered where she belonged. One familiar face in a small market could look at her for 1 second too long and make every forged detail on her papers begin to fall apart. The small market had almost nothing worth buying, but people still came because hunger needed a routine. A few turnips sat on a wooden board, bruised from rain and too many hands. An old woman sold onions from a basket that looked fuller than it was because straw had been packed underneath. The girl entered with her empty basket lowered against her skirt. She kept her face tired. That was still the safest expression. A hungry girl in an occupied village did not look around with interest, and she did not watch every doorway like a hunted animal. She looked at food, counted coins, and hoped nobody spoke to her. Then she saw the woman near the shop door. The woman was older now, with a dark shawl pulled around her shoulders and one hand resting against the door frame. She had known the girl's family before the war, before papers, curfews, and German patrols made every familiar face dangerous. She did not call out or point. She only looked. That was enough. The girl lowered her eyes toward the vegetables. Her hand moved to the basket cloth, not the sleeve, and she forced herself to touch the dull coins as if deciding whether she could afford anything. The woman's gaze stayed on her a little too long. Not long enough for the whole market to notice. Long enough for the girl to feel it at the back of her neck. False papers were made to fool strangers. They could give a name, a place, a purpose, and a reason for travel that sounded clean when spoken to a soldier at a barrier. They could survive a glance from a board guard. They could not change the memory of someone who had watched her grow up. A small community could protect a courier. A baker might pretend not to see her enter a side door. A priest might keep his eyes on the floor while messages passed near the candles. A farmer might say a girl had been helping with work when she had actually been somewhere else. But the same village could also become a trap. People were hungry, frightened, jealous, tired, and sometimes already watched by the Germans. A person did not have to be cruel to become dangerous. Someone could speak because a soldier had threatened their family, because they wanted extra food, or because fear had made silence feel impossible. The cruel thing about occupation was that trust became something people had to ration like bread. The girl turned one onion in her hand and set it back down. She could feel the older woman still looking, though she did not dare check too quickly. The seller muttered a price. The girl shook her head, made a small sound of disappointment, and stepped aside for another customer. Her feet wanted to leave the market at once. Leaving too quickly would be wrong. A girl who had come to buy food did not flee after being seen by a neighbour unless there was something to hide. So she stayed near the stall, looked at the turnips again, and let her shoulders sink. The woman by the doorway shifted her weight. That small movement tightened the girl's stomach. Was she preparing to speak, or only resting a tired knee? Was she watching with pity, suspicion, or memory? There was no way to know. That uncertainty was colder than rain. A German soldier stood farther down the street, near a wall marked by old posters. He was not looking at the girl yet. He was speaking to a man with a sack over his shoulder. But his head could turn at any moment if someone called. A single word from the doorway could draw him over. A name would be enough. The girl imagined how quickly it could happen. The woman might ask why she was so far from the street where her family lived. The soldier might not understand the meaning at first, but he would understand mismatch. He would ask for papers again. Then the false story would have to stand beside a real witness. A forged document could survive ink and stamps, but it could not erase a woman who remembered your childhood face. The girl bought one small onion with a coin she could spare. It was not useful, but it gave her a reason to have entered the market and something to place in the basket. Her fingers closed around it slowly. She did not look at the old woman while doing this. A child brushed past her with a cracked wooden toy in one hand. The small bump gave the girl a chance to turn her body without seeming to choose it. For 1 second, her eyes met the woman's. The woman's expression did not change, but her lips pressed together. The girl could not read that silence. It might be mercy. It might be warning. It might be the moment before betrayal. She left the stall at the same pace she had used to arrive. Her basket now held one onion, a folded cloth, and enough emptiness to match the story of a bad market day. Her sleeve still held the paper. Her face still had to belong to hunger, not fear. At the edge of the market, she heard the woman speak behind her, not loudly, not her name. Only a complaint about prices to another shopper. The girl kept walking, because turning back would reveal that she had been listening for danger more than conversation. The market did not expose her, but it changed the road ahead. She could not risk the main street if someone had recognized her. She could not walk straight to the meeting place if the woman decided to talk later. Familiar eyes could travel faster than soldiers when fear carried them from door to door. There is something deeply unfair about surviving papers, soldiers, and a checkpoint, only to be threatened by one quiet glance from someone who once knew your family. She turned away from the busier street and chose the road that curved behind the last row of houses. It would take longer, and it would make her late if she moved too carefully. But the main street now felt full of memory. The quieter road, at least, had fewer mouths. Still, fewer mouths meant fewer witnesses. Beyond the market, the village thinned into walls, gardens, muddy tracks, and fields where a girl could disappear without anyone knowing exactly when. The basket tapped softly against her skirt as she walked. The onion rolled once at the bottom. The market had reminded her that danger did not always wear a uniform, because sometimes it stood in a doorway and remembered your real name. Now she had to leave the safer streets and choose a quieter route, where fewer people could recognize her. The road around the village would give her fewer eyes, but it could also leave her alone with no witness if a patrol stopped her beyond the last houses. The stone road left the market quietly, bending past the last houses and down toward a low field. Mud had gathered between the stones, and the girl had to place each foot carefully so she would not slip. Behind her the market sounds faded into a few distances and the dull scrape of a cartwheel. Ahead there were fields, bare trees, and a narrow bridge. The quieter road felt safer at first. No soldier stood at the corner asking for papers, no collaborator sat with a notebook, and no neighbour watched from a shop door with memory in her eyes. The girl could breathe without pretending to study onions or count coins. For a few minutes, nobody looked at her. That was the danger. On the main road, a crowd could hide a courier. If a soldier stopped her there, people might see where she was taken, who took her, and when it happened. A woman might later remember the colour of a truck, or a child might repeat what direction the soldiers went. Witnesses did not always save a person, but they made the disappearance harder to erase. The side road gave her privacy, but privacy could turn against her. If a patrol appeared beyond the trees, she would have no shop door to enter, no queue to blend into, no market seller to complain to. Her basket and bread story would look weaker out here. A hungry girl could explain a bakery street more easily than a lonely bridge. Couriers often used roads like this because the official roads were watched. Fields, church paths, graveyards, farm lanes, drainage ditches, and the edges of woods could let a message move around checkpoints instead of through them. These routes were practical, not romantic. They were chosen because mud was safer than a barrier. She followed the track beside the field, keeping the basket on her arm away from the hidden paper. The single onion rolled softly at the bottom with each step. Her shoes collect wet dirt along the edges, making them heavier than they had been in the village. The brown coat pulled at her shoulders. A row of bare trees stood ahead, thin and dark against the grey sky. Beyond them, the small bridge crossed a shallow stream that had swollen from rain. The water moved under it with a low sound, and the girl noticed how loud her own steps seemed on the stones. Every noise belonged to her now. A crowd could make her invisible, but loneliness made every movement feel like a confession. She looked back once, but not too sharply. The village sat behind her in pieces, roofs, walls, smoke, and the narrow street she had chosen not to take. No one seemed to be following the market. Still, the old woman's face stayed with her, quiet and unreadable. The girl kept walking. The meeting place lay farther ahead, beyond the fields and past a bend where the road met a line of hedges. If she lost too much time, the contact might leave. If she moved too quickly, mud on her shoes and breath in her chest would make her look wrong when she arrived. Speed had to be measured. A bird lifted from the field and startled her more than it should have. She stopped beside a fence post and pretended to adjust the cloth in her basket. Her fingers found the onion, cold and rough, and she held it for a second to steady herself. Then she let it fall back. The sleeve stayed close to her arm. She did not touch it. The paper inside had survived the room, the coat, the street, the checkpoint, and the market, but out here it felt more exposed than ever. There was too much open space around it. A cart track crossed the road near the bridge. Fresh wheel marks cut through the mud, deeper than old ones, and one boot print sat beside them. The print was large, with a heel pattern that did not look like a farmer's worn shoe. She slowed before stepping over it. The mud had not yet filled the edges. Someone had passed recently. Her first thought was not panic, but calculation. A German patrol could have crossed toward the field. A local man could have taken a shortcut. A bicycle could be waiting beyond the trees. Nothing in the print proved danger, but everything in this work had taught her that proof usually came too late. She stepped onto the bridge. The stones were slick, and the low wall was cold under her fingers when she brushed it for balance. Halfway across, she heard a faint sound behind her. Not a voice, not a cart, only a small shift of loose gravel. She did not turn at once. Turning too fast would show fear. She reached the far side and bent as if fixing the strap of her shoe. From there she could look down and catch a small piece of the road behind her through the space between her arm and knee. For a second she saw nothing. Then, near the line of trees, something dark moved and stopped. The shape could have been a man. It could have been a coat hanging from a branch. It could have been fear making use of distance. She tied the strap slowly. though it had not come loose. Her mouth had gone dry. There is a particular kind of fear that comes when you are alone enough to hear yourself being hunted. She stood and continued, not toward the meeting place directly, but along the hedge where the road curved. If someone followed her, she had to know before bringing danger to the contact. If no one followed her, she still had to arrive with enough time to hand over the message. Both choices carried risk. The empty road had promised freedom, but it had taken away witnesses, noise, and excuses. It had left her with mud, trees, a bridge, a hidden paper, and the possibility of footsteps that matched her own too closely. The village was now behind her. The next mistake would happen, where no one could swear she had ever been there. The quiet road had helped her leave behind soldiers, neighbours, and market eyes, but it had also stripped away every witness who might prove where she disappeared. Now the smallest sign behind her mattered more than any checkpoint, because a follower might not want to arrest her yet. One bicycle shadow in a rain puddle could mean someone was waiting for her to lead them straight to the next contact. Wet road after the bridge held shallow puddles in the wheel ruts. The girl walked beside the hedge, keeping her basket low and her pace steady. Her shoes made soft marks in the mud, and the single onion knocked lightly against the wood with each step. She did not turn around. A few minutes later, she stopped to tie her shoe. The lace was not loose. She bent anyway, set the basket beside her knee, and lowered her head as if the mud had slowed her down. In the puddle near the road edge, she saw the grey sky, the hedge, and a thin dark shape behind her. A bicycle. It was far enough away to be explained. Someone else could be taking the same road. A farmer's son might be riding between fields. A messenger might be going to a nearby house. Or a man might simply have chosen the quieter route after the rain. But she had seen that bicycle before, near the trees behind the bridge. It had appeared twice. That was enough to change everything. She tightened the lace slowly, though it needed no tightening. Her fingers wanted to shake, so she pressed them into the wet leather until the feeling passed. Then she picked up the basket, stood, and continued without looking back. Fear had to stay behind her face. If she ran, she would answer the question for whoever followed her. A girl going to buy bread did not suddenly break into a run on a muddy road, unless she was guilty, frightened, or carrying something worth catching. If she stopped too long, that could also seem wrong. The road gave her no easy choice. Counterintelligence did not always arrest a courier at the first chance. Sometimes the smarter move was to follow, to wait, and to learn where the message was going. A single courier might lead to a receiver, a safe house, a radio, a hidden store of explosives, or the person who organized several routes at once. Arresting her too early might catch only the smallest fish. That thought was colder than the rain. The girl kept walking, but her mind began changing the shape of the route. The meeting place ahead was no longer just a destination. It was a risk she might carry to someone else. If the bicycle truly belonged to a watcher, then every step toward the contact became a gift to the enemy. She passed a low stone wall and used the corner of her eye to study the road behind her. The bicycle did not come close. That made it worse in a way. A careless follower might rush, but a patient one stayed far enough to look innocent. The distance felt planned. The most frightening follower is not the one who grabs you, but the one who lets you keep walking. Her hand tightened once around the basket handle, and she made herself loosen it. A courier had to give her body ordinary reasons for ordinary movements. She could stop to fix a shoe, look at a field, check coins, move the basket from one hand to another, or pause near a shrine as if gathering breath. She could not behave like someone measuring danger. A narrow path branched toward a farm gate. She did not take it. Choosing too sudden a turn could prove she knew she was followed. Instead, she slowed near a ditch where rainwater had overflowed, lifted her skirt slightly to avoid the mud, and gave herself a reason to glance sideways. In a broken puddle, the bicycle shape appeared again. The rider had stopped. She did not see his face clearly. He could have been a local man in a dark coat, or a German plainclothes watcher, or someone forced to report movements on that road. The uncertainty mattered more than his identity. If he were innocent, changing plans could endanger the mission. If he were not, continuing could endanger the network. A hidden message could be heavier after it left a checkpoint than before it reached one. At a checkpoint, danger stood in front of her. Here it followed behind, quiet and patient. She could not ask it what it knew. She remembered the instructions from the closed room. Do not bring danger to the contact. Do not complete a meeting if you think the route is being watched. Do not prove fear, but do not let pride finish the errand for you. A failed delivery could be repaired later, but a captured receiver could break the chain. Today, a person might cancel a meeting with one message, but she had to cancel with footsteps, silence, and a face that still looked hungry. If you are finding this story worth staying with, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this quiet side of war history. It helps keep these forgotten stories alive without breaking the calm of the night. Now we can return to the road. The girl reached a bend where the hedge thickened. Beyond it, the original meeting route would continue toward a wall near the church road. She had been told the sign to look for there, and she had repeated it until it sat in her memory like a prayer. Now that memory felt dangerous. She slowed again and shifted the basket to her other arm. The sleeve with the paper stayed close, untouched. Her mouth had gone dry, and the onion in the basket seemed absurdly loud each time it rolled. No one nearby spoke. The bicycle bell did not ring. No wheel clattered fast behind her. That silence made her think the rider was waiting for her to choose. A watcher did not need to know the plan if she kindly led him to it. There was a small lane ahead, one that did not lead directly to the meeting place. It curved toward the cemetery wall and then back toward the village by a longer route. Taking it would cost time and might mean missing the contact. Not taking it could lead a shadow straight to the person waiting for her. The decision had to look like nothing. She paused near the hedge, opened the basket, and pretended to check the onion as if deciding whether to return to the market for something else. Then she turned toward the lane with the tired annoyance of a girl changing errands after a bad morning. Her pace did not change. Inside, everything changed. She was no longer trying to deliver the message quickly. She was trying not to deliver the enemy with it. The paper in her sleeve still mattered, but the person waiting for it mattered too. If she were wrong, she would lose time. If she were right, she might save more than herself. The lane narrowed between wet stone and grass. She listened for the bicycle, without appearing to listen. A faint scrape came from the road behind, then stopped again. The sound was small, but it followed her into the turn like a hand placed lightly on the back of her neck. There is something especially cruel about a mission, where bravery can mean walking away from the very thing you were sent to do. She had learned that being followed was not only a threat to her own life, but a way to use a fear as a roadmap to the whole network. Now, she had to do the hardest thing a courier could do. Abandon the first meeting without looking like she had abandoned anything at all. At the next wall near the church, someone might still be waiting for her, unaware that a bicycle shadow could turn the handoff into a trap. Near the stone church, The first meeting place waited exactly where she had been told it would be. A mossy wall ran beside the small churchyard, with a narrow stretch of road where a person could pause without looking too unusual. Farther away, under the edge of a roof, a dark figure stood where a contact might stand. The girl kept walking. She did not turn toward the wall. She let her eyes pass over it as if she had never been given its shape in memory. The basket stayed on her arm, the onion rolled softly inside it, and her shoes dragged a little mud from the side road. She looked like a girl who had taken the wrong way and was too tired to care. That was the act. The meeting point had been chosen because it was ordinary. People passed churches, walls, wells, and small shop every day, so a brief pause could disappear inside the village routine. A courier could adjust a scarf, set down a basket, or pretend to rest her feet while another person came close enough to receive a message. Simple places were useful because they did not announce themselves. But simple places could become traps just as easily. If the bicycle shadow was still behind her, walking to the wall would not be courageous. It would be a delivery service for the enemy. The contact might be waiting with empty hands, unaware that someone else was watching the road. She felt anger rise in her throat. Not loud anger, not the kind that makes a person shout, but the bitter kind that comes when doing the right thing feels like failure. She had carried the paper through the coat, the street, the checkpoint, the market, the side road, and the bridge. Now she had to pass the one place where she was supposed to stop. Sometimes the bravest choice is the one that looks exactly like giving up. Secret networks had rules for this because courage alone could destroy them. Meetings could be cancelled due to missing signals, wrong objects, absent marks, or a person walking past without stopping. Backup places existed because no one could promise the first place would stay safe. Waiting times were short because every extra minute gave danger more room. The girl had been told this in the closed room, but hearing a rule and obeying it with the meeting place in front of her were different things. The wall was close enough that she could see damp moss between the stones. The figure under the roof shifted once. Her fingers tightened around the basket handle, then loosened again. She walked past. No one called her. No hand lifted from the shadow. No signal came that told her the road was safe after all. The silence did not comfort her, because silence could mean discipline, danger, or that the person waiting had already understood what she was doing. A church bell rope hung near the open side door, but no bell rang. A few raindrops fell from the roof edge onto a wooden barrel. A cat crossed near the wall and disappeared through a gap in the stones. Everything around her looked too normal for the amount of risk inside the moment. She kept her pace unchanged until the wall was behind her. Then she moved toward the cemetery path, where a row of leaning crosses stood behind a low iron gate. The path would not take her directly to the second route, but it would give her a reason to turn without making the turn look military. People visited graves. People took shortcuts through churchyards. That was useful. The anger in her chest did not leave. Somewhere behind her, a contact might now be counting minutes and deciding whether to abandon the place. He might think she had failed, been caught, lost courage, or taken the wrong road. He might leave with disappointment in his face, and never know that not stopping had been her way of protecting him. A reckless courier would have completed the handoff to prove she was brave. A careful courier had to accept being misunderstood. That was harder than it sounded. A person can prepare for fear more easily than for the shame of appearing useless. In a modern world, cancelling a meeting can be a message on a screen, but for her it meant walking past a living person while pretending he meant nothing. She passed through the cemetery gate and let it close softly behind her. Wet grass brushed her shoes, and the basket knocked once against an iron post. She did not look back toward the wall. She found a grave marker, stopped beside it, and bowed her head as if she had come for the dead. For a moment she had cover. Her face could be lowered. Her stillness could look like grief. Her breathing could settle without looking suspicious. Even then she listened for a bicycle wheel, a bootstep, a voice. Any small sign that the shadow had followed her past the church. No one came at once. That did not mean no one would. The paper remained in her sleeve, and now it felt hotter than before. It had not been delivered, so it was still her responsibility. The first plan had failed by choice, and the second plan would be slower, dirtier, and less certain. The message still had to move. She knew the alternate route only in pieces. Past the cemetery wall, behind a row of sheds, near the old drainage ditch, then toward a place where another signal might be checked. It was not a clean route through streets and shops. It was the kind of route people used when they did not want their shoes, clothes, or faces noticed too closely afterward. The girl stood by the grave long enough to make the pause believable. Then she adjusted her scarf, lifted the basket again, and walked deeper along the path. The church wall disappeared behind yew branches. The first meeting was gone. There is a hard kind of discipline in choosing not to finish a mission when finishing it would feel easier than turning away. She had walked past the first mission and left the waiting contact behind, not because the message mattered less, but because the network mattered more. Now the paper still had to travel through the dirtier backup route, where clean streets and public witnesses would no longer protect her. Ahead waited animal sheds, cemetery walls, and a drainage tunnel where one trapped girl could vanish with the message still sewn inside her coat. Mud climbed the edge of her shoes before she had taken 10 steps behind the cemetery wall. The path was not really a path, only flattened grass between leaning stones, a cattle shed, and puddles darkened by rain. She lifted the hem of her skirt with one hand and kept the other arm close to her side without touching the hidden sleeve. The clean road was gone. Behind the church, the village lost its public face. There were no shop windows, no line of women waiting for bread, and no bored soldier standing where everyone could see him. A low shed leaned near the wall, with wet straw pushed around the doorway, and old boards stacked beside a broken pail. She moved past it slowly. This was the safer route. Safer did not mean clean, short, or kind. It only meant fewer eyes, fewer notebooks, and fewer places where a soldier could ask for papers in front of everyone. Couriers often had to use farm paths, back sheds, graveyard walls, cellar doors, and drainage routes because official roads belonged to the occupation. The message did not care about dignity. A folded paper connected to a great invasion could still pass behind animal stalls and through mud. That was the strange truth of secret work. A bridge, a railway line, or a meeting time might matter to men landing from the sea, but the road carrying it could smell of dung, wet stone, and old straw. War did not make important things clean, it only made dirty routes necessary. She paused beside the cattle shed and listened. Rain dripped from the roof edge into a cracked bucket, one drop after another. Somewhere inside the shed, an animal shifted against wood, and the sound made her shoulders tighten before she recognized it. Her shoes sank deeper when she stepped away. The cemetery wall guided her toward the drainage opening. It was low, half hidden by weeds and loose stones, not made for a person who wanted to keep clothes whole. Rainwater had passed through earlier, leaving silt along the bottom and bits of straw caught at the entrance. No guard would choose to stand there unless suspicion forced him. That was useful. She set the basket down first and pushed it into the opening. The onion rolled once and knocked against the wood. Then she lowered herself, one knee touching cold mud, one hand against damp stone, her coat pulling tight across the shoulder. The hidden paper seemed suddenly too close to every rough surface. If the sleeve tore, she might not know until it was too late. If the seam caught on stone, she might pull away and expose the repair. If she slipped, mud could press into the lining and make the paper swell or stain. A tiny mistake could leave evidence on the cloth. She moved through slowly. The stone scraped her palm, and the smell of wet earth sat in her mouth. There was no noble posture here, no clean picture of bravery, only a girl crouched in a drainage passage, trying not to damage the message sewn inside her coat. A modern person might imagine secret work as codes and clever devices, but sometimes it was only mud, a cramped passage, and the need not to panic. She came out behind another yard, breathing harder than she wanted to. Her skirt was dirty, one shoe nearly stuck, and a loose strand of hair had fallen under her scarf. She pulled the shoe free with a soft sucking sound and stopped herself from making any noise afterward. Even frustration had to stay quiet. The dirt helped her and hurt her. A muddy girl could claim she had taken a bad path, crossed a field, or slipped near a ditch. Too much mud could make people wonder why she had gone behind Shenred's greaves instead of staying on the road. If this quiet side of war history is the kind of story you want to hear more often, you can like the video and subscribe before we continue. It helps keep these forgotten lives from disappearing completely. She wiped one hand on the inside of her skirt where the mark would be less visible. The basket still held the onion, now bruised on one side, and a strip of wet straw had caught on the handle. She removed it carefully and dropped it behind a stone. Small evidence mattered. The route continued along the cemetery wall. Old names passed beside her shell, softened by rain and moss. She did not read them. The dead were less dangerous than the living, but even a graveyard path could be watched by someone who knew it well. At the far end, a gap between two sheds led toward the second contact route. She stopped before entering it, not to rest, but to listen again. The backup path had protected her from the main road, but it had made her dirtier, slower, and easier to question if she returned to open streets. The paper was still safe, for now. There was something unfair about how courage could look from the outside like shame, poverty, or a girl making poor choices in dirty places. She had not failed because she was muddy. She had survived another piece of the road. But each survival left a trace on her clothes, her shoes, and her nerves. She straightened the code wet as she could and kept the sleeve away from the shed wall. The next receiver was somewhere beyond this uglier route, but reaching him did not guarantee safety. He could have been moved, watched, arrested, or replaced. The paper still needed the right hands. She had carried the message through mud, animal sheds, cemetery walls, and a drainage passage no soldier would search unless suspicion pushed him there. But the dirty route only brought her to another kind of danger, because the next receiver might no longer be safe, free, or truly on her side. Soon she would see a man fixing a bicycle give the right signal, while one wrong cloth on a crate could mean he had already been turned into bait. Beside the village storehouse, a man knelt over an overturned bicycle with one wheel lifted from the ground. His sleeves were rolled to the forearm, and his hands were blackened with grease from the chain. He did not look at the girl when she came into the lane. He only turned a nut with a small wrench and kept his head lowered. A pale yellow cloth lay on a wooden crate near the door. It had been placed folded once, with one corner hanging over the edge, just as she had been told. The sign was small enough to mean nothing to anyone passing by. To her, it meant the second contact might still be alive. Might. She stopped a few steps away, not close enough to seem familiar. The empty basket hung from her arm, with the bruised onion at the bottom, and mud dried unevenly on the wood. Her shoes were dirty from the drainage path, and one side of her skirt carried a dark stain near the hem. She looked like someone who had taken a bad road for a bad errand. That helped. The man kept working on the bicycle. He spun the wheel once, listened to the chain, and wiped his thumb against a rag. If he recognized her, he did not show it. If he feared her, he did not show that either. The whole meeting had to look like two strangers sharing the edge of the same ordinary day. Secret contacts were not supposed to greet each other warmly. A smile could be remembered. A nod could be reported. Even a look held too long could become aligned in someone's memory if Germans came, later, asking who had spoken to whom. In work like this, friendship had to hide behind the manners of strangers. The girl stepped nearer to the crate, as if making room for someone passing behind her. No one passed. She looked at the storehouse door, then at the road, then back at her basket. The man reached for the pale yellow cloth and moved it a little to the left. That was the second sign. Still, she could not trust it completely. A correct sign did not prove the man was safe. It only proved someone knew the sign. He might have been followed, threatened, beaten, or forced to stand there with the right cloth in the right place, while another pair of eyes watched from a window. A trap could wear the shape of safety. She checked what she had been told to check. The cloth corner hung outward, not inward. The bicycle wheel was raised, not flat on the ground. The man had no cap beside him, though he might have worn one on a normal day. Each detail mattered, because each one reduced the chance that she was walking into a prepared lie. Her mouth felt dry again. She wanted to ask a question, any question, just to hear his voice and know whether fear had changed it. But a real contact did not need conversation to prove himself. Words were useful only when they could survive being overheard. Most words could not. The man said something about bad roads without looking at her. It sounded like a complaint, the kind a villager might make to anyone standing nearby. She answered that the rain had made the fields worse. The words were plain. Their meaning sat underneath. He tightened the bolt too hard, then loosened it again. His hands were steady, but there was a small cut near one knuckle, and dried blood had darkened the skin beside it. She noticed it and wished she had not. A cut could mean farm work, a tool slip, or something done in a room without witnesses. The cruelest part was needing help from a man while also wondering whether his pain had already been used against him. Time pressed against her. The message had already missed the first meeting. Every extra minute could make the next route less useful, the next contact more exposed, and the information older than it should be. But handing over the paper to the wrong person would be worse than arriving late. Late could still be repaired. Betrayal could spread. The man lifted the bicycle chain and set it back onto the gear, his sleeve pulled up as he worked, showing a dark bruise near his wrist. She looked away before the glance became too direct. The bruise made her think of interrogation, but suspicion could invent stories as easily as fear could invent shadows. A woman crossed the far end of the lane with a bundle of sticks. Neither of them moved. The girl adjusted the cloth in her basket. The man leaned closer to the bicycle wheel and muttered that the axle would hold if no one forced it. That was the phrase she had been waiting for. She answered softly, not too fast, not with relief. Just the words she had learned, shaped like a tired reply about roads and broken things. The man's hand paused for less than a second, then continued turning the wrench. The pause told her enough. They were still not safe, they were only less uncertain. The cloth was right, the phrase was right, the reply had been accepted, and no alarm had followed. The lane remained quiet. The storehouse door stayed closed. She moved closer to the crate, as if setting the basket down to rest her arm. He shifted the bicycle wheel, creating a small screen between his hands and the street. The paper inside her sleeve seemed to burn against her skin, not because it was hot, but because it had waited too long to leave. There is a hard discipline in meeting an ally and still treating him like a possible enemy until the final second. The man did not reach for her. That would have been too obvious. He reached instead for the rag beside the crate, missed it by a little, and let his hand rest near the edge. She bent toward the basket, her sleeve moving closer to him than to the road. The message was still hidden. For one thin moment, the whole route narrowed into distance, cloth, hands, and timing. If she moved too early, the gesture would show. If he moved too late, someone might enter the lane. If either of them looked at the other with recognition, the meeting would become a memory someone could use. The second contact had given the right signs, but trust in that lane had to be built from cloth, silence, grease, bruised hands, and half-spoken phrases. Now the message could finally leave the coat, but it had to vanish so smoothly that even a watcher nearby would see only a girl resting her basket beside a broken bicycle. One clumsy movement of her sleeve could expose the paper before it ever reached his palm. Beside the storehouse, the bicycle wheel turned once and clicked softly against the chain. The man kept one hand on the frame, his head lowered, as if the repair mattered more than the girl beside him. She set her basket on the ground near the crate, close enough to be useful, far enough to look accidental. Mud pressed around her shoes. The lane stayed quiet, but quiet was not the same as empty. A soldier's shadow could still appear at the far end, or a woman could step from a doorway with a bucket and remember every movement. The girl did not look around too much. People who had nothing to hide did not measure every window. A small nail lay near the bicycle wheel. She saw it because she had been looking for a reason to bend. The nail was bent, rusted, and probably useless. But in that moment, it became part of the handoff. She shifted the basket with her foot, frowned at the mud, and bent as if picking up something that might tear a shoe. The man's hand moved to steady the wheel. That was the cover. The paper had to leave the sleeve without becoming an event. There could be no handshake, no whisper, no careful exchange that made the air tighten around them. A girl near a bicycle and a man fixing a wheel had to remain in a small scene in a village lane. Nothing more. Her fingers touched the nail first. Cold rust pressed into her skin. With the same motion, her other hand slid near the cuff, where the loosened seam had been prepared enough for one final pull. She felt the folded paper shift under the lining. Her mouth went dry. The whole road had led to a movement so small that anyone watching had to believe nothing had happened. The man leaned closer to the wheel. His body blocked part of the view from the lane, but not all of it. His sleeve brushed the rim, and his fingers rested open for less than a second near the edge of the crate. He did not look at her hand. Looking would have ruined it. She lifted the nail as if annoyed by it. At the same time, the folded paper slipped into her palm, stiff and warm from being against her body. It was smaller than it felt. For a moment she held it between two fingers, hidden by the basket handle and the angle of her sleeve. Then it was gone. The man's hand closed around it without reaching, like someone taking a message. He only adjusted the wheel, took the rag, and let his palm pass through the place where her hand had been. The paper moved from sleeve to skin in less time, than it took for the bicycle wheel to settle. A passerby would have seen a girl picking up a nail. That was the point. Secret exchanges often survived by looking too plain to deserve memory. A packet could be left under a stone, a note pushed into a glove, a mark placed on a wall, or a handoff hidden inside a gesture people saw every day. The safer movement was not the cleverest one. It was the one nobody wanted to describe later. If anyone had seen the paper, there would be no good explanation. A girl pretending to buy bread did not pass folded messages to a man with grease on his hands. A bicycle repair did not require a coded scrap from a coat sleeve. Both of them would become guilty at once. The man wiped his fingers on the rag. The paper disappeared into the rag fold, then under the edge of the crate, then somewhere she could no longer see. She felt the loss of it, almost like a missing weight. Though it had weighed almost nothing, that should have brought relief. Instead, it brought another danger. A courier who had just completed a delivery might breathe differently, stand too loosely, or look back to confirm success. Her body wanted to sag from the strain, but that would be a confession. She still had to be the girl with the basket, not the girl whose message had just changed hands. Today, even handing someone a folded receipt would barely matter, but in that lane, one scrap could turn two strangers into prisoners before sunset. She dropped the bent nail into the mud beside the basket. The man muttered something about a ruined wheel, loud enough for the lane, but not loud enough to sound staged. She gave a tired shrug and picked up the basket. The onion rolled once and stopped. A figure moved beyond the storehouse doorway. It was only an old man crossing the yard with a sack over one shoulder, but her heart struck hard before her mind understood him. The man on the bicycle did not react. His calm helped her recover faster than any spoken warning could have done. She stepped back from the crate. One step only, then another. She did not hurry, did not thank him, did not look at his hands. The bicycle chain clicked again behind her, returning the scene to something ordinary. Something is frightening about a moment that can decide lives while looking smaller than a daily errand. No shout marked it. No door slammed. No one in the lane knew that the paper had left one person and entered the next part of the network. She kept walking with the same tired pace she had used before. The empty place in her sleeve felt louder than the hidden paper had felt. Now she had to survive without guarding it, without showing that anything had changed, and without leading anyone's eyes back to the man behind her. The hardest second had passed, but the dangerous minutes after it had just begun. The paper had finally left her coat in a movement hidden behind a nail, a bicycle wheel and a basket set down in the mud. But the handoff was only safe if she could walk away without relief, without a backward glance, and without letting her body reveal that the errand was complete. A single breath too deep after leaving the crate could tell a watcher that the girl with the basket had just done something worth following. She walked away from the storehouse with the same tired pace she had used before the handoff. The basket hung from her arm, lighter, now only because the secret had left her sleeve, not because anyone watching would understand that. Her coat was still muddy near the hem, and one shoulder still held the damp mark from the drainage passage. She did not turn around. That was the rule. The man behind her returned to the bicycle, or at least that was what she had to trust without checking. The wheel clicked once, the chain shifted, and the lane accepted the sound as ordinary repair work. She wanted to know if he had hidden the paper well, if he had stood too quickly, if anyone had seen the rag move. Wanting did not matter. A courier could ruin a successful handoff by leaving badly. A backward glance could tie two strangers together. A sudden faster pace could tell a watcher that the important moment had already happened. Even relief could have a shape if the body released it too openly. She reached the corner of the short stone street. A German soldier stood farther ahead, smoking under the edge of a doorway, his helmet tilted low against the damp air. He did not look busy, and that made him worse. A busy soldier had orders. A bored soldier had time. Her breathing tried to change. She kept it shallow. The empty sleeve felt strange against her arm. For hours her body had guarded the paper, feared the seam, and measured every movement around that hidden weight. Now the paper was gone, but her nerves still behaved as if it were there. She had to teach herself not to protect an empty place. The body does not stop being afraid just because the dangerous object has left it. She passed a closed shop with cracked paint on the door. In the dark glass her reflection appeared for half a second. Muddy skirt, brown coat, scarf pulled too low, basket swinging with almost nothing inside. She did not look like someone who had helped move a message tied to the coming invasion. She looked like a girl who had failed to buy enough food. That was good. The soldier took the cigarette from his mouth and watched the street in the lazy way of someone who had not yet chosen a target. She kept her eyes forward, not fixed on him, not avoiding him too carefully. The basket gave her a reason to be there. The bruised onion gave the basket a reason to exist. A few steps from him, she slowed near a puddle because the stones were slick. The movement looked practical. Her shoes were genuinely muddy, so she did not have to fake caution. A small mercy. He said nothing. She moved past him with the same tired face. No question came. No hand reached for her papers. No voice called her back toward the storehouse. The quiet should have helped her, but after the handoff, the quiet felt like a delayed trap. In ordinary life, finishing an errand means you can finally relax. But in her world, relaxation was the first thing that could betray her. She did not return by the same route. That would be foolish. Anyone who had marked her arrival might wait to see whether she came back with less purpose in her steps. Instead, she followed the street toward the edge of the village, where a narrow path passed behind a row of small gardens. She let the basket bump her skirt as if irritation, not training, guided her. Inside, the pressure shifted from delivery to disappearance. She no longer needed to guard the message. She needed to make herself uninteresting after having been useful. That was a different kind of danger, softer and harder to notice. Behind her, the paper had begun its next life. It might already be under the crate, inside the rag, beneath a loose board, or in the man's hand waiting for the next movement. The girl would not know. Secret work rarely gave anyone the comfort of seeing the result. She reached a place where the road widened near a low wall. 2 women were speaking there. Their voices flat with hunger and weather. One glanced at her muddy skirt and looked away. As if dirt explained everything. The girl almost felt grateful for being dismissed. Almost. There was still the bicycle shadow to think about. There was still the possibility that the first meeting had been watched, that the second contact had been marked, or that a watcher had decided not to interfere until the message moved higher up the chain. The paper left in her sleeve did not end the danger. It only changed who carried the worst part of it. A step too quick could still matter. A hand raised to wipe sweat could still look wrong. A glance back toward the storehouse could still tie her to the man and his bicycle. She kept walking until the lane turned and the building disappeared from view. Only then did she let her shoulders drop slightly. Not enough for anyone else to notice, just enough for pain to return to the muscles that had been holding fear all morning. The basket handle had left a red mark across her palm. There is something cruel about surviving the hardest moment, then having to pretend nothing inside you has changed. She had done what she was sent to do, but survival did not allow celebration. The safest version of her was still hungry, tired, muddy, and disappointed by a bad market day. No one could be allowed to see the other version, the one who had walked away from a living wire of names, routes, and danger. That girl had to stay hidden too. She had delivered the paper and walked away without turning her head, keeping relief locked behind the same tired face that had carried her through the village. But once the message reached the right hands, the danger could spread outward instead of ending, because German security might notice the network moving before the landings. By that afternoon, a truck entering the village square could mean the hunt had already begun. By mid-afternoon, trucks rolled into the village square with mud on their tyres and soldiers sitting stiffly in the back. A loudspeaker crackled from one vehicle, ordering people out of houses and into the open. Doors opened slowly at first, then faster when rifle butts struck wood. The girl watched from behind a curtain in a house that was not hers. The paper was no longer in her sleeve. That should have made her safer, but safety had not arrived. It had only moved away from her body and spread into the village around her. The message had gone forward, and now the village seemed to be paying for movement no one could openly name. German security before D-Day was tense for a reason. Rumours of an invasion had thickened in the air, sabotage had increased, railways were watched, and any unusual movement could make an occupying force nervous. When nervous men had trucks, weapons, lists, and authority, they did not need proof before turning a village upside down. Suspicion was enough. A soldier kicked open the bakery door. Another pulled sacks from the back room and cut one open with a knife, spilling flour across the floor. The baker stood outside with both hands visible, his face grey and useless with fear. His wife kept looking toward the alley as if someone might still escape through it. No one escaped. The villagers were lined beneath the church wall, close to the place where the first meeting had almost happened. Women held children against their skirts. An old man without his cap blinked in the light, confused by the speed with which an ordinary day had become a public search. A young boy stared too long at the soldiers until his mother turned his face down. The girl stayed behind the curtain. She could not help. Helping would mean stepping into the square, and stepping into the square would mean becoming visible at the wrong moment. Her hands pressed against the windowsill until the wood marked her fingers. The bitter part was that doing the right thing could still leave innocent people standing under rifles. The house across the square was searched next. A mattress was dragged outside and cut open. Drawers were emptied onto the street. A woman cried when a soldier shook out baby clothes as if a radio might fall from them. Another soldier checked the stove, the floorboards and the space behind a religious picture on the wall. The girl knew what they were looking for, even if each soldier did not. Papers, names, wires, batteries, maps, hidden compartments, anything that could suggest a network moving before the landings. They might not know about the exact message she had carried. They only needed to feel that something was alive under the surface of the village. That was enough to hunt. A local collaborator walked beside an officer with a notebook. The girl recognized the slow way he looked from one doorway to another, collecting faces more than facts. People like him made the search sharper, because soldiers could read documents, but locals could read habits. A closed shutter, a missing son, a woman who looked too pale, all of it could become useful. One man was pulled from the line and asked for his papers twice. He answered once, then again, then glanced toward his wife. That glance was too much for the soldier questioning him. He was pushed toward the truck, not beaten badly in the open, not yet, but enough for everyone to understand the rule. Fear was being arranged in public. The girl wanted to hate herself for carrying the paper, then hated the occupation more for making that thought possible. The message was meant to slow German movement and help the coming landing, not bring trouble to people who had never touched it. But the secret war did not consequences neatly attached to the person who chose them. It spilled. In ordinary life, a mistake belongs to the person who made it, but under occupation, danger could be charged to an entire street. The search moved toward the shop where the old woman had watched her. The girl felt her throat tighten. If that woman spoke now, if she mentioned seeing a familiar face in the wrong market, if she remembered the basket and the muddy skirt, the whole day could turn back toward her. The curtain suddenly felt too thin, but the woman said nothing in the square. She stood with her shawl pulled tight and her eyes lowered. Maybe she knew nothing. Maybe she knew too much and chose silence. Maybe she was too afraid to speak either way. The soldiers kept moving. By late afternoon, the village looked bruised. Flour lay in the bakery doorway, a broken chair rested in the street, and a child's blanket had been dropped in the mud. The girl could see people counting who had been taken and who were still standing. She could not ask about the man with the bicycle. That silence hurt most. The paper had left her, but she still carried the weight of it in another form. She had no way to know whether the raid came because of her route, another courier, a radio signal, a rumour, or pure German fear before the invasion. War rarely allowed clean answers. It only left damage. The villagers had been searched, frightened, and forced into lines because the Germans felt the hidden network moving beneath ordinary streets. But while soldiers tore through houses below, the paper continued upward through hands she would never see, becoming part of a larger plan than her own small errand. Somewhere beyond the square, a railway bridge was being circled on a map, and one delayed German train could decide whether men on the beaches lived long enough to leave the sand. On a larger map, her small paper no longer looked like a secret carried in a sleeve. It lay beside a red pin, a railway line, and a bridge marked in pencil near a route German units might need if the invasion came. A man with tired eyes wrote a time beside the track, then checked it against another note brought from another village. The paper had entered the chain. The girl would not see this room. She would not know who unfolded the message, who read it twice, or who decided that the mark on the railway mattered enough to act on. By then, she might still be hidden behind a curtain, listening to trucks in the square. Her part had become invisible even to her. That was how the network worked. D-Day needed ships, aircraft, landing craft, soldiers, commanders, and weather good enough to risk the crossing. But it also needed German reactions slowed on the ground. If railways could be damaged, phone lines cut, bridges watched, and roads made unreliable, then German reinforcements would not move as smoothly toward Normandy. A few lost hours could matter. The message she carried might not order anything by itself. It might confirm that a bridge was guarded lightly, that a rail section could be reached after dark, or that a contact would meet a sabotage team at a certain hour. It might only complete the information already gathered by others. But a missing piece can still stop a plan from becoming action. A hand pressed the paper flat near the map. Another hand moved a red pin from one side of the track to the other. Someone muttered a correction about the road beyond the bridge, then rubbed out a line with the edge of his thumb. Pencil dust smeared across the paper. Small marks changed lives. The resistance work around Overlord was not only about dramatic explosions. It involved watching, reporting, delaying, confusing, and passing information through people who often knew only one narrow part of the whole. A rail line could be cut in the right place, a signal box damaged, or a message passed that told a group when not to move. A quiet note on a table could matter as much as noise on a battlefield if it changed when men arrived. The girl did not need to understand the invasion to be part of it. She only needed to bring the paper through the village without being stopped. Someone else needed to read it correctly. Another person needed to carry the next instruction. A small group somewhere near the line needed to be ready when the time came. That chain was fragile. One courier late by an hour could make a team miss a patrol gap. One wrong bridge name could send men toward guards instead of the track. One frightened contact could disappear before receiving the next instruction. Every piece depended on people who would never all sit in the same room. The map showed lines, but the lines hid bodies. A railway meant workers, guards, patrols, bolts, stones, signals, and men lying in wet grass waiting for darkness. A bridge meant a place where someone had to carry tools, explosives, wire cutters, or sometimes only information. A delay was not created by magic. It was created by risk. Today, we might see a railway delay as an inconvenience on a screen, but a delayed train could mean fewer German troops reaching the coast while men were still trapped on open sand. That did not make the girl a commander. It did not make her the centre of D-Day. It made her one small part of a system that needed small parts to work. Somewhere, the man with the bicycle may have passed the paper again. Perhaps it went into another pocket, under another floorboard, or into another room where a radio waited under cloth. Perhaps the information was copied smaller, changed into a mark, or carried by someone who never learned where it began. The girl's sleeve had only been one station in the journey. She would probably never be told what happened. Secret work rarely returned with a clean answer. No one would come to her after the war and say that a train had been late because she kept walking through mud. No one would point to a bridge and explain that her errand had helped make it harder for German movement that night. That kind of hope had to stay unfinished. Still, hope could exist without confirmation. A girl could remember the paper, the coat, the checkpoint, the market, the bicycle, and the storehouse, then never know whether the line she helped complete held back one truck, one train, one order, or nothing at all. That uncertainty did not erase the danger she had carried. It only made the courage harder to measure. In the larger room, the map stayed open. A cigarette burned low in a dish. Someone folded another note and handed it to a man who left without looking important. The red pin remained beside the railroad. The plan continued moving. There is a quiet sadness in risking your life for a result you may never be allowed to see. The paper had done what it was meant to do if it reached the right hands at the right time. It did not need to contain grand secrets to matter. It only needed to help one part of the network act more accurately than it could have acted without her. That was enough to be dangerous, and that was also what made the next thought so frightening. If such a small piece could help delay a train, then the same small piece captured earlier could have helped the Germans move against the people waiting in the dark. Usefulness and danger lived inside the same folded scrap. Her paper had become one small mark in a wider chain of railway lines, bridge timings, and sabotage plans meant to slow German movement before the landings. But the same usefulness that made it valuable to the resistance would have made it terrifying in German hands. Had it been found in her sleeve at the first checkpoint, the map might have filled not with red pins for sabotage, but around names, safe houses, and people marked for arrest. A German officer would not need the whole invasion plan to make use of a captured paper. He would not need the names of the beaches, the hour of the landings, or the full Allied order of battle. A few local names, a password, a marked railway route, or a bridge connected to sabotage would already be enough. That was the colder truth. The paper in her sleeve could not have ruined all of D-Day by itself. An operation that large was protected by layers of secrecy, planning, deception, and divided knowledge. A village courier was not carrying the entire future of Europe under one seam. That would be a false story. But false stories are not needed here. The real danger was smaller and more believable. If the paper had been found, it might have exposed one contact, one safe house, one route, one sabotage team, or one local plan to slow German movement. That would not stop every ship from crossing the channel. It could still destroy the people nearest to the paper. On a German table, the scrap would look different. Under a lamp, beside a magnifying glass and a local map, the marks that seemed harmless to a guard might begin to mean something to a trained officer. A village name could be circled. A time could be checked against patrol reports. A code word could be copied and tested against prisoners. The officer would not need to understand everything. He could start with what was useful. Send men to the bridge. Watch the road near the church. Arrest the man who repairs bicycles. Question the family whose address appears too often near suspicious movement. A small truth in enemy hands can be more dangerous than a large secret nobody can use. This is why secret networks divided information. A courier might know only where to carry a message, not why the message mattered. A receiver might know a signal, not the whole network behind it. A sabotage group might know one rail line, not the larger plan of the invasion. Each person held a piece because no person could be allowed to hold too much. That system protected the whole operation. It also made every person lonely in their own task. The girl could risk her life without knowing the exact result of what she carried. The man with the bicycle could receive a message without knowing who had written it. A team waiting by a bridge could act without knowing which ship offshore might benefit. Compartmentalization sounds clean when described later. In real life, it meant fear was divided into human portions. One girl held a sleeve, one man held a rag. One woman watched a curtain. One courier remembered a lane. The pieces were small enough to carry and heavy enough to break people. If the paper had been captured at the checkpoint, German security might not have shouted about D-Day at all. They might have moved quietly, because quiet movement catches more people. A house could be watched instead of raided at once. A courier could be followed instead of arrested. A false message could be sent back through the network. That would be worse. A network could survive one arrest if it knew the arrest had happened. It might change routes, burn papers, move radios, and abandon names. But if the Germans learnt enough to wait, then the danger would travel invisibly. People would keep walking into familiar places that had already been turned against them. Today, people often imagine the danger as one dramatic secret being stolen. But in this kind of war, one local detail could quietly poison an entire route. The girl did not need to know any of this in full to feel it. She had felt the risk in the soldier's questions, in the woman's long stare at the market, in the bicycle shadow behind her, and in the man's bruised wrist at the second contact. Every step had shown her that the paper was not powerful because it was grand. It was powerful because it was specific. Specific things are what arrests are built from. A name, a street, a time, a meeting sign, a bridge, a repair shop, a yellow cloth on a crate. None of these would look like history to someone passing by, but together they could become a map of people who trusted one another in the dark. There is a hard honesty in admitting that the paper did not carry the whole fate of D-Day. It keeps the story from becoming a cheap legend. The girl was not secretly holding every Allied plan in her coat. She was holding something more human, which may be more frightening. She was holding enough. Enough to get herself killed. Enough to endanger the man with the bicycle. Enough to send soldiers to a bridge before a sabotage team arrived. Enough to make a safe house unsafe. Enough to make families in the village stand under rifles while men with notebooks asked questions that sounded ordinary. A German officer could place the paper beside a local map and begin turning ink into action. He could circle houses, compare names, send patrols, and order roads watched before anyone understood what had happened. He could protect the very bridge that the resistance needed to be damaged. He could make one small piece of preparation fail exactly when it needed to work. That is, the kind of damage that matters in a real war. Not always the collapse of an entire operation. Not always a spectacular reversal. Sometimes it is one team arrested before nightfall, one train not delayed, one radio seized, one frightened prisoner pushed until another name falls out. The disaster can be local and still be unbearable. The frightening part is that the smaller truth is more believable than the larger myth. The paper could not destroy D-Day alone, and saying so does not reduce the danger. It makes the danger clearer. Large operations survive because many separate parts keep working, and one broken part can still cost lives even if the whole machine continues. The girl's paper belonged to that smaller, sharper kind of risk. She may never have understood this balance. She may have known only that the paper was dangerous, that the people in the room spoke carefully, and that a soldier's hand near her sleeve could end more than her own life. That was enough knowledge for one person to carry. More might have made walking impossible. The paper could not have destroyed the entire invasion, but it could have exposed a local chain of names, routes, passwords, and safe houses at the worst possible hour. Because the secret was divided into pieces, each person carried only a fragment, and often never learned where that fragment fit. The next truth is quieter, because the girl might help open the road to Normandy without ever knowing which beach, which unit, or which desperate hour her errand had touched. Night settled over the village without making it peaceful. The trucks had gone from the square, but their tires marks removed the mud, and a broken chair still leaned near the bakery wall. The girl stood in a small yard behind the house where she had been hidden, her brown coat hanging from her shoulders instead of fully worn. Above her, a distant aircraft moved through the dark. She did not know where they were going. She could hear them only as a low pressure in the sky, far away and uneven, like the war breathing beyond the roofs. No one came out to explain whether they were bombers, reconnaissance planes, transports, or something else. In occupied France, most people learned to hear large events before they understood them. The body knew before the mind did. She had delivered the paper. That was the one fact she could hold. It had left her sleeve, passed to the man with the bicycle, and moved into a part of the network she was not allowed to see. After that, everything became guesswork. A person at her level did not receive the full picture. She knew a route, a signal, a contact, and a reason to keep quiet if taken. She did not know which beach would matter, which ships would cross, or which commanders had planned the hour. That ignorance was not an insult. It was protection. If she were arrested, she could not reveal what she had never been told. She could not betray the whole invasion because the whole invasion had never belonged to her. The system was built that way on purpose, dividing danger into pieces small enough for ordinary people to carry. Still, a small piece could cut deeply. The strange unfairness was that she could risk her life for history without being trusted to know the history she was serving. She looked toward the window, where a weak strip of light crossed the yard. Inside, someone moved quietly, perhaps setting a cup down or closing a drawer. No one spoke loudly that evening. The search had left fear in the walls, and even safe houses seemed to listen after a raid. Her sleeve felt different now, empty but not harmless. The seam was still there, the rough repair still visible if she looked for it, and the memory of the paper stayed close to her skin. She had carried nothing home, yet she had not come back unchanged. The village around her did not know what to do with hope. People had heard rumours for months, rumours of landings, secret armies, false ports, strange radio phrases, and German nervousness. Some believed the Allies would come soon. Some had stopped believing anything until they saw uniforms change in the streets. Hope was dangerous under occupation. A person could smile at the wrong time and be questioned. A person could repeat a rumour to the wrong neighbour and bring soldiers to a door. A person could celebrate too early and suffer for a victory that had not yet arrived. The girl knew this, so she kept her face still, even alone in the yard. She wondered whether the paper had mattered. Maybe the route it is named would be used. Maybe the time would be changed. Maybe the bridge had already been watched by someone else. Maybe the man with the bicycle had passed it forward before the Germans tightened the village again. There was no answer. Today, people expect to see the result of a message almost instantly, but she had to live with silence after risking everything to send one. The distant aircraft continued moving. She imagined men somewhere preparing boats, rifles, maps, engines, and medical bags. She imagined railways in the dark, guards near bridges, and resistance teams waiting for signals they could not discuss openly. None of it came to her as a clear picture. It came as fragments. That was fitting. Her entire part in the war had been made of fragments. A scrap of paper, a sleeve, an empty basket, a checkpoint answer, a bicycle wheel, a yellow cloth, a muddy drainage passage. None of these looked large enough to belong beside the word invasion. Yet together they formed the hidden road beneath it. She might never know if one German train was slowed because she kept walking. She might never learn whether one rail team arrived on time because her note reached the map room. She might never hear the name of the bridge again. The war did not owe its smallest workers a report. That was hard to accept. There is a quiet pain in doing something dangerous and then being asked to return to ordinary silence. She could not tell the people in the square what she had done. She could not ask whether the man with the bicycle survived. She could not even allow herself to feel proud in a way that showed on her face. Still, pride existed somewhere under the fear. Not bright pride, not the kind that stands in speeches, but a small private knowledge that she had not failed when it mattered. She had reached the contact. She had protected the network from the watcher. She had carried her fragment to the next hand. That had to be enough. She stood in the dark without knowing the beaches, the timetable, or the full plan, but her small errand had already joined the hidden work leading toward Normandy. When the real landing came, the news would not arrive as a clean announcement, but as aircraft, rumours, German movement, and fear spreading back through the villages. Morning would bring the first signs that the war had changed its voice from far away, and she would understand that the paper in her sleeve had belonged to a day much larger than herself. Morning came with aircraft before it came with certainty. The girl stood near a shop door with the same empty basket she had used before, but the street around her felt different now, tighter and more awake. The sky held more noise than usual, not one distant engine, but layers of engines moving somewhere beyond what the village could see. People listened, without lifting their heads too openly. No one said the word invasion at first. Words like that were too dangerous in a village still occupied by German soldiers. A woman sweeping dust from her doorway stopped after 3 strokes and forgot to continue. A man carrying a sack paused near the well, then remembered himself and moved again. The girl looked down the road where German vehicles had begun to pass more quickly than usual. A motorcycle went first, then a truck with soldiers sitting hard silent in the back. Another truck followed with a canvas pulled tight over something inside. The men did not look bored anymore. That was the change. For people on the Normandy beaches, D-Day was water, sand, gunfire, landing craft, smoke, and men trying to stay alive under open fire. For people behind the lines, it arrived as signs. More aircraft overhead, more German urgency, more officers are shouting near vehicles, more rumours are moving from door to door in voices barely louder than breath. The girl did not see the sea. She did not see the landing craft or the soldiers falling in the surf. She saw the road outside a French village, a soldier tightening a strap, a driver swearing at a stalled engine, and civilians pretending not to understand why the morning had changed. And history reached her through fragments. She had to keep her face still. A smile would be dangerous. A tear could be dangerous too. If the Germans were moving because the landings had begun, then joy could become evident. A girl who looked relieved while soldiers rushed toward the coast might invite questions she could not answer. The cruel joke was that liberation could begin while the people waiting for it still had to act, disappointed by the weather. The shopkeeper near her kept arranging the same few goods on a shelf. His hand touched a tin, moved it, then moved it back. He had heard the planes too. Everyone had heard them. Nobody wanted to be the first to say what they might mean. A German soldier crossed the street and ordered 2 men away from a doorway. His voice was sharper than it had been the day before. He pointed toward the road, then toward a cart, then cursed when the cart owner did not move fast enough. Panic, when it wore a uniform, still expected obedience. The girl held the basket with both hands. Her sleeve was empty now, but the memory of the paper stayed in the cloth. She wondered where it was at that moment. Perhaps it had already been copied, marked on a map, or turned into instructions for men near a railway line. Perhaps it had done its work and vanished. There was no way to know. After the Allied landings began, German forces behind the coast still had to move, protect routes, hold roads, respond to sabotage, and hunt the networks that had been disturbing their communications and transport. For civilians and couriers, danger did not end when the invasion started. In some places, it sharpened. A retreating or pressured occupier could become more violent, not less. The girl understood this in the way people understand danger, without needing a lecture. She watched the soldiers move too fast, watched the officers look too tense, and watched villagers lower their eyes more carefully than before. Hope had entered the village, but it had entered with trucks and rifles still present. Hope had to hide. Today, good news can be shouted, posted, shared, and celebrated, but that morning, good news had to stay buried under a blank face. If this quiet side of war history is the kind of story you want to hear more often, you can like the video and subscribe before we continue. It helps keep these small human moments from disappearing behind the larger battles. A boy near the corner whispered something to his mother, and she gripped his wrist hard enough to stop him. The girl saw the boy's mouth close at once. Even children could sense that the morning had a rule. Listen, but do not speak. Another aircraft sound rolled across the sky, lower this time, or perhaps fear made it feel lower. A few people looked upward before stopping themselves. The German soldier at the corner looked up too, and for once his face showed more than authority. It showed uncertainty. That small glimpse should have made her happy. Instead, it frightened her. Fromelt control slipping, often reached for whatever was closest: a civilian, a house, a list, a suspect, a village already marked by whispers. The landings might be happening far away, but punishment could begin right here. The girl moved from the shop door and crossed toward a wall where she could stand without seeming to wait for news. Her basket swung against her skirt. The onion was gone now, eaten or discarded, but the basket still served its purpose. It made her a girl with errands instead of a courier with memories. A woman passed close enough to murmur that something had happened on the coast. She did not stop. She did not look at the girl. The words fell between them and disappeared. The girl felt her chest tighten, not with fear alone, but with a joy she had no safe place to put. She wanted to laugh. She wanted to cry. She wanted to ask if the bridge had been hit, if trains had been delayed, if the man with the bicycle was alive, and if the paper had reached the right room before the night ended. Instead, she lowered her head and adjusted the basket cloth. That was all she could do. There is something painful about hearing history arrive and not being allowed to welcome it. The day might become famous somewhere else. But in her village, it was still a day of watching soldiers hiding expressions and surviving until dark. Freedom had not yet walked into the street. Only the first sound of it had reached the sky. By noon, the rumours grew thicker. Some said paratroopers had landed. Some said ships filled the sea. Some said the Germans would punish every village suspected of helping. No one knew which rumour was true enough to risk repeating. The girl stayed careful. She had learned that a message could save lives and endanger them at the same time. Now the same was true of hope. It had to be carried quietly. She heard D-Day, not from the beaches, but through aircraft rumours, hurried German vehicles, and the sudden change in men who had seemed untouchable the day before. Yet the beginning of liberation did not make the village safe, because frightened occupiers could become more brutal as their trollmap began to crack, and the coming days would bring lists hidden under floorboards, safe houses abandoned in minutes, and people hunted harder because freedom was finally moving closer. After D-Day, the village did not become free all at once. German vehicles still passed through the main road, sometimes faster than before, sometimes packed with men who looked more nervous than tired. The sound of engines came at odd hours, and doors closed quickly when they approached. Hope had arrived, but it had arrived with fear beside it. In the room where the girl had been hidden, a floorboard had been lifted near the stove. Under it lay a folded list of names, wrapped in cloth and tied with a string. The woman of the house took it out, stared at it for a moment, then pushed it back into the hollow space with trembling fingers. Names were becoming too dangerous to keep. A safe house down the lane had already been emptied. The curtains were closed, the bed stripped, and the small table near the window left bare, except for a ring of dust where a lamp had once stood. No one said where the people had gone. In those days, even asking could become a mistake. A contact failed to arrive that afternoon. Not late, not delayed, simply absent. The girl waited long enough to understand what absence meant, then walked away with a face that showed nothing. Missing person could mean arrest, flight, betrayal, or death. Silence had many meanings. The success of the landings did not protect people behind the lines immediately. In many places, the resistance became more active after the invasion, and German security became more desperate to stop it. Roads, railways, bridges, and communication lines mattered even more now because armies were moving and time was shrinking. That made every suspected courier more dangerous in German eyes. The bitter thing was that the closer freedom came, the more violently some people were hunted for helping it arrive. The girl was told to leave before dark, not with a dramatic farewell, not with thanks, only with a cloth bag, a different scarf, and a new name to remember if stopped. Her old story had been used too many times. Her face had passed too many dangerous eyes. She packed almost nothing. A spare pair of stockings, a crust of bread, a folded cloth, and a small comb with 2 missing teeth went into the bag. The brown coat stayed on her shoulders, though the sleeve was empty now. It still felt guilty. In the corner, papers were being burned in a metal basin. Not all papers looked important. Some were receipts, addresses, notes about food, old messages already used, and scraps with numbers that might mean nothing to a stranger. But no one trusted strangers anymore. The flame made each page curl into black. The girl watched one edge glow orange before it collapsed into ash. It was strange to think that a life could be protected by destroying proof that it had done something brave. The safest record was no record at all. That felt unfair, but unfairness had become ordinary. Outside, a German truck stopped near the square. Voices rose, then fell. Someone shut a window too quickly and the wooden frame struck hard enough to make everyone in the room freeze. For several seconds, no one moved. Then the burning continued. That was how people lived after the news from the coast. Half preparing for liberation, half preparing to be caught before it arrived, a person could hear rumours of Allied progress in the morning and still be searched by German soldiers before evening. The war did not loosen its grip neatly. Today, people often imagine victory as a door opening, but for her, it was more like hearing footsteps coming closer while the lock was still on the outside. She wondered about the man with the bicycle. No one mentioned him. That could mean he was safe, or it could mean his name had become too dangerous to speak. She remembered his bruised wrist, the pale yellow cloth, the grease on his fingers, and the way his hand had closed over the paper without looking at her. She might never see him again. The woman of the house gave the girl a small piece of bread and touched her cheek once, quickly, as if even tenderness needed to hurry. There was no speech about courage. No one had time for a scene. The girl took the bread, placed it in her bag, and nodded. A new route was chosen. Not the market street, not the bridge road, not the path past the cattle shed, if it could be avoided. Too many places had become marked inside her memory. The village that had hidden her now seemed full of invisible lines she must not cross again. She stepped toward the back door, then stopped when another engine passed outside. Everyone listened until it faded. The old woman by the stove whispered that waiting could be more dangerous than moving. The girl understood. There was a hard fear in leaving a hiding place before knowing where the next one would hold. But staying meant letting the net tighten around her. German units might be losing ground elsewhere, yet here they still had guns, notebooks, informers, and enough anger to make a final arrest matter. A last revenge could still kill. She pulled the new scarf lower around her face. The cloth bag rested against her hip. The brown coat smelled faintly of damp wool, smoke, and the road behind the cemetery. She no longer carried the paper, but the paper had carried her into a life where ordinary return was impossible. There is something cruel about surviving the mission, and then realizing survival itself has become another assignment. By evening, she left through the back way, past the bar garden wall, and into a lane where wet leaves stuck to her shoes. Behind her, the room continued to burn small papers into ash. Ahead, another name, another house, and another kind of silence waited. Freedom was moving closer, but so were the men who wanted names before they lost control. She had survived the handoff, the raid, and the first days after D-Day, but the success of the invasion had made the hunters more desperate, not less. Now she had to leave behind rooms, names, papers, and people who could no longer be safely remembered aloud. When the shooting finally moved farther away, the paper would vanish from the record, while the girl who carried it would be with a silence no medal could easily fill. After the fighting moved away, the kitchen became quiet in a way that felt almost suspicious. Cups stood beside the sink, towels hung near the stove, and a small table carried bread, a knife, and a bowl with a chipped rim. The girl, older now in the face, though not yet old in years, stood at the basin and washed cups with careful hands. Outside, people spoke of D-Day as if it belonged only to beaches, ships, and men in uniforms. She did not correct them. The stories came back in large shapes: landing craft, naval guns, paratroopers, commanders, soldiers climbing through surf and smoke. Those stories were true, and they deserved to be told. But they left little room for a muddy road behind a cemetery wall or a paper hidden in the sleeve of a brown coat. Her part did not sound grand when spoken aloud. She had carried a message, avoided a checkpoint, walked past a meeting, changed route, and handed a scrap to a man fixing a bicycle. No trumpet belonged to that. No parade knew how to honour a girl who survived by looking tired, hungry, and forgettable. That was the point. In a way, the best secret work often disappeared because success meant nobody noticed it at the time. If a courier was remembered too clearly, something had gone wrong. If a handoff became a story in the street, the network was already in danger. If the paper reached the right hands and vanished, then the silence afterward was part of the victory. It is almost unfair that the safest mission was the one history could most easily forget. She folded a towel and placed it beside the stove. The motion was ordinary, but her hands sometimes remembered other things: damp thread, a basket handle, a wet sleeve, the rough edge of a drainage stone. A drawer near the table held a small sewing box, and under the needles lay a piece of old brown cloth cut from the coat long after it had stopped being useful. She rarely touched it. People asked about the war sometimes, but not always in a way that allowed a real answer. They wanted neat memories, clear sides, brave moments, and endings that made sense. She had no such clean thing to give them. Her memory had mud in it. She could not always tell the names. Some people had died. Some had survived and wanted silence. Some had done brave things under false papers and later returned to being shopkeepers, widows, clerks, farmers, or women who did not like strangers asking questions. Speaking carelessly could reopen wounds that peace had only covered. So she listened more than she spoke. When men described the invasion with maps and arrows, she looked at the table. When someone praised generals, she did not argue. When someone said nobody in small villages could have done much, she rinsed another cup and let the water run over her fingers until the heat faded. Today, recognition can be measured in names, photographs, and records. But many wartime lives survived only as whispers inside families and boxes. Nobody opened for years. Many women in resistance and intelligence work were recognized late, quietly, or not at all. Some left traces in official files. Some appeared only in testimonies, local memory, or documents opened long after the danger had passed. Others remained folded into the lives around them, known by a few people and then by no one. History has many drawers. She did not need everyone to call her a hero. That word would have felt too large for the girl she remembered being, the one with muddy shoes and a bruised onion in her basket. But it hurt that the work could vanish so easily, as if only the loudest parts of war had mattered. The quiet parts had carried weight too. There was a kind of bitterness in that, but not a clean bitterness. She knew the men on the beaches suffered terribly. She knew ships, aircraft, and soldiers had paid in ways she could not compare to her own road. Still, the comparison did not erase her part. It only made it harder to speak. A cup slipped once in her wet hand and struck the side of the basin. The sound made her flinch before she could stop herself. No one else in the room noticed. That was how the war stayed, not always as a story, sometimes as a small reaction the body kept without permission. She dried the cup and set it down. The brown coat was gone, except for the piece in the sewing box. The paper was gone too, copied, passed, burned, or lost somewhere in the machinery of survival. The man with the bicycle had become a question she rarely asked aloud. The village had changed, but not enough to make memory harmless. There is a quiet sadness in surviving something hidden, because afterward, even proof can feel like danger. Someone might speak of D-Day and point to the coastline on a map. They might explain the beaches, the ships, the aircraft, the weather, and the command decisions. All of that would be necessary, but the map would still be missing the kitchen table, the old coat, the drainage ditch, the yellow cloth, and the girl who could not look back after handing over a folded scrap. She placed the towel in a neat square and closed the drawer. The sewing box remained inside, with its needles, thread, and a small piece of cloth. It was not a medal, it was not a record, but it held enough for her. The war had ended, but the girl's part in it survived only in quiet gestures, a hidden cloth scrap, and memories she could not always safely explain. Yet that disappearance is exactly why the story matters. Because D-Day was never only made by the men seen on beaches and ships. Beneath the famous maps were couriers, villagers, radios, false papers, and ordinary hands that were never allowed to make one mistake. A hidden paper in a sleeve, a damaged railway line, a radio covered with cloth in an attic, and a villager lying calmly to a German guard, all belonged under the shadow of the same day. None of them looked as large as a battleship or as dramatic as a landing craft moving toward the shore. They did not fill the sky with smoke or make the ground shake under heavy guns. Still they mattered. On a wide table, a map of Normandy could hold the larger war in clean shapes. Small model ships sat near the coast, pencil lines crossed roads, and red pins marked railways, bridges, and villages that had become important for reasons ordinary people were not allowed to discuss. Beside the map lay a train ticket, a folded message, a radio code written on thin paper, and a photograph of a young girl no commander would ever recognize. The table looked organized, but the lives behind it were not. D-Day was not made by one girl. It was not saved by one folded note, one bicycle repair, or one muddy route behind a cemetery wall. A story becomes weaker when it turns one small person into the secret center of a giant operation. The truth is more careful than that. Operation Overlord depended on soldiers, ships, aircraft, landing craft, deception, weather, fuel, timing, command decisions, and the huge machinery of Allied planning. It also depended on people inside occupied France who knew the ground, watched German movement, damaged rails, passed messages, hid radios, and lied at the right second. A bridge could matter because a German unit needed it. A peasant path could matter because a courier could use it. The girl belonged to that smaller machinery. She did not command anything. She did not know the full plan, and she did not need to know it. Her task was to carry one dangerous piece through a place where one wrong pause, one wrong answer, or one wrong glance could destroy people near her. The quiet power of her work was not that she changed everything alone, but that everything became more fragile if enough people like her failed. Think of a woman pushing a radio wire behind a basket of potatoes before a search. Think of a railway worker wiping grease from his hands while remembering which trains passed after dark. Think of a priest lowering his eyes when a stranger entered through a side door. Think of a farmer saying he had seen no one, though muddy shoes were drying beside his stove. These were not scenes made for monuments. They were too small, too nervous, and too ordinary. But a great operation needed the ordinary world to bend without breaking. A local lie could protect a hidden man. A hidden man could carry a warning. A warning could help delay a train. The famous pictures of war often show ships, aircraft, uniforms, smoke, and maps. Those things are easier to remember because they leave clear shapes behind. Quiet networks are harder to hold in memory because the success required them to disappear. If a courier did her work well, the street looked unchanged after she passed. That does not make the work small. A damaged rail line might not win a battle by itself, but it could slow movement at a crucial hour. A cut telephone wire might not end a campaign, but it could delay an order. A hidden note might not decide D-Day, but it could help one group act before German troops reach the wrong place. Real history often moves through many hands at once. Today, people often look for one dramatic cause behind a great event, but real history is usually built from many hands doing one dangerous thing correctly. The girl's paper should be kept in its proper size. Too much exaggeration would make the story dishonest. Too little attention would erase the real danger of carrying local intelligence under occupation. The paper did not carry the entire invasion, but it carried enough risk to make a soldier's search deadly. There is dignity in that balance. She was not the centre of D-Day. She was not meaningless either. She was one of all people who could not afford a single careless mistake while larger forces moved toward Normandy. The same balance belongs to the others around her. The man with the bicycle could not afford to look relieved. The woman at the curtain could not afford to move too quickly. The villager in the square could not afford to say the wrong name. Everyone had a small role, and every small role had sharp edges. A map shows routes, not trembling hands. It shows railways, not the girl standing with mud on her skirt. It shows bridges, not the man who waits in wet grass beside one. It shows a campaign, not the fear of being recognized by a neighbor in a market. That is why the small story matters, Naz. Without it, war becomes only arrows and equipment. Without the larger story, the girl's fear becomes only one frightened day. Together they show how a huge operation could reach through an old coat, an empty basket, a dirty road, and a folded scrap of paper. The wider story of D-Day belonged to ships, aircraft, soldiers, deception, weather, logistics and command, but it also belonged to couriers, radios, false papers, muddy shoes, and villagers who learned how to lie without blinking. From that balance, the story narrows again to a brown coat hanging quietly after the war, with a repaired sleeve that no stranger would bother to examine. That old lining would hold no grand monument, only the memory of a scrap of paper that once made a young girl dangerous to an army. An old brown coat hung beside a window after the war, its cloth faded, its elbows thin, and its lining repaired so poorly that no stranger would ever stop to examine it. The room around it was quiet now, with a small table, a cup left to dry, and pale light resting on the floor. A white scrap of paper lay nearby, harmless in the open, Nothing like the folded message that had once lived inside a sleeve. No one passing the window would know. That is how many hidden wartime stories survive. Not as statues, not as speeches, but as ordinary objects that no longer explain themselves. A coat becomes only a coat again. A basket becomes something for bread. A road behind a cemetery becomes a muddy shortcut instead of a place where fear once had to crouch low and keep moving. D-Day is often remembered through beaches, landing craft, aircraft, tanks, commanders, and men stepping into fire. That is right, because those things were real and terrible and necessary to remember. But great operations also passed through people who never stood in the famous photographs. They passed through couriers, villagers, radio operators, railway workers, and women who had to look harmless while carrying danger close to their skin. The girl with the paper did not hold all of D-Day in her coat. She did not know every beach, every ship, every timetable, or every deception plan. She was not the secret centre of the invasion. The story would become false if it claimed that. But she held enough to be arrested, enough to expose names if the wrong hand found it, enough to lead soldiers toward a safe house, a bridge, a railway line, or a man waiting with a bicycle. Enough to show that a small piece of secret work could be local and limited, yet still deadly in the wrong hands. The truth does not need exaggeration to be frightening. This is the lesson the old coat leaves behind. Secret war was not only guns, codes, radios, and bold men whispering over maps. It was also wet shoes, bad stitching, empty baskets, tired faces, fake errands, neighbours who looked too long, and the discipline not to turn around after doing something dangerous. It was the ordinary world forced to carry extraordinary risk. A person can say that the paper was only a fragment, and that is true. A person can also say that fragments matter when thousands of lives depend on timing, movement, silence, and trust. A bridge delayed by sabotage, a rail line damaged in darkness, a message passed through a village, a contact protected by one wise decision not to stop. All of these could become part of the larger pressure around Normandy. No single fragment was the whole invasion. Many fragments made the road. The girl may have lived the rest of her life with no public proof that her walk mattered. She may have heard other people speak of D-Day in larger words. While her own memory stayed small and difficult, she may have folded towels, washed cups, and kept an old piece of cloth in a drawer because there was no safer monument for what she had carried. Peace does not always know what to do with secret courage. There is sadness in that, but also dignity. A hidden act does not become worthless because it was never loudly praised. A silent risk does not become small because no parade repeated the name of the person who took it. Some people helped history move forward by making sure no one stumbles them at all. It is almost cruel that the best way to survive such work was to disappear from the story afterward. This girl should be understood as a respectful composite of many couriers, resistance helpers, and local networks around occupied France, unless a story chooses one documented person with sources of her own. That matters because the real history is already powerful enough. We do not need to pretend that one girl could ruin the entire invasion alone. We only need to understand that one captured message could ruin lives near it. That is more honest, and it is more human. A German officer did not need the whole plan to destroy a village network. A name, a password, a route, a bridge, or a time could be enough to begin arrests. A courier did not need to know the entire operation to risk everything for one correct delivery. Between those two facts sits the true weight of the paper. The old coat by the window carries that balance. It does not shout, It does not explain, it simply hangs there, with a repaired lining that once made a young woman dangerous to an army and vulnerable to a careless search. The cloth remembers what the official maps cannot show. This is why the story returns to the smallest image at the end. Not a fleet at sea, not a general at a table, not a headline announcing the landings, but a girl standing still while a soldier checks papers. A sleeve that must not be touched. A face that must look tired instead of terrified. Compared with the great machines of war, she looked like almost nothing. And that was exactly why she could move through places where louder courage would have died quickly. The paper did not make D-Day by itself. It did not decide the whole war. It did not turn one courier into the centre of history, but it shows how history can pass through small hands before anyone knows what those hands have done. And maybe that is the quietest truth of all. Many people who help history happen do not get to stand beside it when it is finally named. They carry one object, keep one secret, survive one road, protect one person, and then return to a life where silence becomes part of the work. The world remembers the day, but not always the hands. So when we think of D-Day, we can remember the beaches and the ships, but also the brown coat, the muddy path, the covered radio, the yellow cloth, and the girl who walked away without looking back. We can remember that courage is not always loud enough to be recorded. Sometimes it is folded smaller than a thumbnail and sewn into a sleeve. The girl did not carry all of D-Day, but she carried one dangerous fragment through a world where one mistake could have crushed lives, routes, and hidden rooms before the landings began. Her story ends not with a grand monument, but with an old coat, a repaired lining, and the quiet knowledge that history sometimes moves through people who are never allowed to be seen. Thank you for listening. Rest well and good night.